The sun did not merely rise, it hammered. Day after day its heat poured down onto the East African plains like a silent fire. Trees had thinned, shadows had retreated, and in the open, something was changing. A creature once cloaked in fur now stood bare beneath the sky, exposed, vulnerable, but somehow free. This was not vanity. This was survival. 1.5 million years ago, the ancestors of modern humans stepped fully into the light. Their skin, darkened by melanin, became the canvas of a new kind of adaptation. No longer hidden in forests, no longer protected by shade. They ran, not fast, but far, chasing antelope not with claws, but with breath, sweating, cooling, enduring. Fur would have suffocated them. Parasites would have followed them. Heat would have ended them. But the loss of hair, that strange, invisible shift, opened a door to something extraordinary. When humans first lost their body hair, they began to reshape the relationship between body and world. Skin became the interface. Pain, pleasure, contact, communication, all flowed from that exposed surface, and that moment, that quiet, evolutionary shedding, would ripple forward into everything that followed. This is Midnight Sapien, slow science and long-form human stories. Just below the video, there's a button that says subscribe. You can press it any time and unsubscribe anytime too. And if you tap the bell icon next to it, it will gently let you know when a new story arrives. Subscribing helps this channel survive. Without it, new videos simply can't be made. If these stories bring you calm, you can tap the super thanks under this video. It truly helps keep these prehistoric journeys alive. And, I always wonder where these stories are being heard. Where are you listening from? What time is it for you right now? If you feel like sharing, drop a comment. Just as a quiet reminder, we're all listening together. Also, if you drift off, that's okay. Timestamps are in the description in case you wake up later. We start with a shadow. The first poetic subject. A body made bare. Why are we naked? Not metaphorically, but literally. Why, among the millions of fur-bearing mammals and among our closest relatives, the chimps, the bonobos, the gorillas wrapped in dense coats of protection, are we the strange exception? Why do we walk exposed, bare to the sun, bare to the wind, bare to the eyes of others? This is not a trivial curiosity. It is a wound in the story of our species, a scar that became a signature. We, the only primates to shed our fur, did not do so by accident. Somewhere along the jagged path of deep time, hairlessness became an inheritance, a decision made not with intention, but with sweat, with heat, with the pressure of survival whispering in the language of biology. This absence, this curious lack, is where our story begins. Not with what was added, but with what was lost. Not with invention, but with subtraction. And yet within that subtraction something emerged. Because the absence of fur is not emptiness, it is adaptation, it is expression. It is the quiet architecture of change laid bare across skin. Human skin. Skin that became visible, readable, permeable. But when did this happen? And more importantly, why? What did it mean to walk into the open, no longer concealed by the ancestral shroud of hair? To confront the blazing eye of the sun not from beneath the forest canopy, but in the unrelenting clarity of the savannah? What must it have felt like to lose that familiar veil of warmth, of texture, of invisibility? To grow more vulnerable, even as one grew more enduring? What happens to a creature when it loses its boundary with the world? What happens to a species when the body becomes a message? Because the truth is not simply that we lost our fur, it is that we revealed ourselves. 1.5 million years ago, give or take 100,000 revolutions of the Earth, something in the lineage of Homo erectus, one of our great ancestral cousins, began to look different. They were still strong, still tool-using, still walking tall on 2 legs. But their skin shimmered in the sun not with fur but with sweat. Their scent changed. Their movements changed. Their relationship to heat and distance changed. And all of this was written on the surface of their bodies. Nakedness, not as shame, but as signal, as transformation. And with that transformation came a paradox, because to lose fur is to lose protection. Against the cold, against the claw, against the parasite, fur is a shield. It is insulation, camouflage, armour. To give it up is to become more fragile, and yet somehow more advanced. What could drive such a change? To answer that, we must go backward, not just in space, but in temperature. We must return to a world growing hotter, drier, wider. A world where the forests retreated and the open land expanded like a curtain being drawn back. In that bright and merciless theatre, the rules were rewritten. Trees no longer formed a canopy of safety. Predators stalked in open view, and to survive here, something more was required than strength. Something quieter, something hidden in the skin. It is here that we begin to understand the bear shadow, not as a defect, not as a mistake, but as a beginning. And with that transformation came a paradox. The shedding of fur did not just expose the body, it exposed an entire lineage to a new way of being. To be naked under the sun is not merely to survive differently, but to experience differently. The wind feels sharper, the touch of another becomes clearer, sweat beads on the skin and tells the story of effort, of pursuit, of fear. With fur, these sensations were muffled. With bare skin, they became intimate. The body, once concealed, became a landscape. What evolutionary pressure could make this worthwhile? To answer, we must sit beneath a Pleistocene sun. Imagine a horizon stretching flat and wide, grasses whispering in the dry breeze, and herds of antelope shimmering in the heat. The hominins that hunted them could not match their speed. No claws, no fangs, just persistence, just patience, just the will to keep moving. Across mile after mile of scorching terrain they ran, not in sprint but in sequence, jogging, tracking, following. Letting the animal exhaust itself while they stayed cool, shedding heat through countless tiny sweat glands, now humming across their bare skin. Fur would have trapped the heat. It would have drowned the body in its own temperature. But a naked body coated with salt water and air could keep going, could outlast, could endure. Is that how it began? Not with a mutation, but with a chase. This is the first theory, the persistence hunting hypothesis. That hairlessness evolved not for comfort nor for aesthetics, but as an engine for the most grueling pursuit the savannah could demand. Imagine this. The animal ahead slows, its breath becomes ragged, the sun has nowhere to go, no trees to fall behind, and the human, or the not quite human, keeps coming, cooling as it runs, shimmering in the sun, but this alone is not enough. Because cooling comes with a price. Without fur one burns, one bleeds more easily, one suffers through the cold nights. So what then balances the scale? Some have pointed to parasites, lice, fleas, ticks, creatures that thrive in fur, in damp nests, in matted coats. Strip away the fur and suddenly these blood drinkers have nowhere to hide. Naked skin is easier to groom, to keep clean. Could this have been part of the story? A war not of spears and bones, but of bites and itches. Or perhaps the answer lies not in what hairlessness removed, but in what it enabled. Communication, expression, the visibility of health, of emotion, of intention. A face no longer covered in dense hair could show more than a snarl. It could blush, pale, twitch, frown. It could reveal fear without a sound, attraction without a word. Was our bareness the beginning of our openness? Even today, the human face is an arena of signals. Muscle and blood and breath work together to create language beneath language, and all of it rests on visibility. So then the question deepens. Was the loss of fur not a vulnerability, but a strategy? And if so, what kind of species uses its own body as a canvas? What kind of ancestor steps willingly into exposure, not just to sun and wind and pain, but to one another? To be visible is to be known, and to be known is to surrender control. The furred body can hide its injuries, disguise its arousal, obscure its sickness. The naked body cannot. Human skin became not just a biological surface, but a social surface, a map of intention, trust, truth. evolution carved new meaning into our visibility. The body, now without fur, became a mirror. And that mirror began to reflect more than heat. Consider for a moment the sensation of embarrassment, the blush that rises, involuntary from the skin. It is a biological betrayal, a signal we cannot mute. It reveals shame, attraction, guilt. But it is only possible in a species that has nothing to hide behind. The same is true for pallor, for sweat, for the sudden bloom of red that rushes across the face in fury or fright. Nakedness allowed the inside to come to the surface, to become readable. Was this a burden, or was it the beginning of empathy? Because in a world of exposed bodies, reading others became survival. Who is wounded? Who is healthy? Who is aroused? Who is afraid? These were not just social questions. They were existential ones. A single glance could reveal what an entire coat of fur might have concealed. The tribe became more connected, more in tune, more aware. Does this mean we chose nakedness not only for endurance, but for connection? It's difficult to say where function ends and meaning begins. In evolutionary terms, every trait begins in silence. A chance mutation, a shift in environment, a subtle push across generations. But some traits carry echoes far louder than their cause. Hairlessness may have started as thermoregulation. It may have helped us chase antelope or flee lions, but it also changed the way we looked at each other, the way we touched, the way we desired, the way we feared. And that shift did not happen all at once. It was slow, geological slow, a follicle here, a gland there. Over hundreds of thousands of years, bodies began to shimmer differently, darker, slicker, more adaptive. The shift was not uniform. Even today, humans vary greatly in hair thickness and distribution. But the general arc was clear. The heavy coat of our primate cousins gave way to something more exposed, and where there was once protection, there now stood vulnerability, or perhaps something even stranger, a new kind of strength. Because to live in one's skin is to risk everything. Cold becomes sharper, scrapes become deeper, nights are colder, days hotter. But with that risk came new forms of mastery: fire, shelter, clothing, tools, each one, in some way, born from the need to protect this new, sensitive body. The hairless body demanded culture. It demanded innovation. Could it be that the body made the mind? Could the decision, unconscious, unchosen, to lose our fur have forced us toward everything else we would become? To walk into the world unarmored is not just a biological fact, it is a philosophical stance. A naked animal must think ahead, must plan for shade, for warmth, for protection. The hairless body became a demand, an evolutionary whisper that said, adapt or perish. And in meeting that demand, early humans did something remarkable. They began to extend their bodies through invention. A handful of dried grass became insulation. A stitched hide became warmth. Fire, once feared, became a friend. From the moment skin was left unguarded, the world itself was invited to help cover it. The environment did not just shape the body, in its new bareness, began to shape the environment in return. And still, something deeper was unfolding. Because the exposed body is not just an object to be protected, it is also an object to be seen. And once seen, it must be interpreted. The bareness of skin introduced not only new sensations but new emotions: shame, pride, seduction, vulnerability. From these, social dynamics began to shift. Who could be trusted? Who could be approached? Who could be touched? These questions, so primal, so human, may have found their roots in the loss of hair. Even infants respond to skin. The warmth of contact, the softness, the rhythm of a mother's breath against a naked back. These are not cultural. They are ancient. They are sensory bridges that connect us to the very first ones who walked bare under the African sun. Did they cradle their children differently, feeling the heat of their skin against theirs? Did they understand, without language, that this connection was a kind of safety? And what of the cold? It is easy to imagine the sun. To see the shimmering mirage of heat driving humans out of their fur. But what of the night? The sudden drop in temperature, the wind curling over the grass. Did they huddle closer? Did fire become not just a tool but a ritual, a daily return to warmth, to safety, to light on skin? The loss of fur made heat a necessity, but in that necessity new behaviours emerged, behaviours that would one day become stories. And what of death? What happens to a hairless body beneath the sun when it is still? Without fur to slow the process, the signs come quickly. Flies, rot, collapse. The living could read the dead more clearly now, could sense danger more quickly, could respond, avoid, bury. Perhaps this too shaped our sensitivity to the body, its fragility, its transience. Our rituals of grief may stretch back to this moment, the moment we became visibly mortal. Was nakedness the beginning of reverence? To see another clearly, to see their health, their suffering, their need, is to be bound to them in a new way, not just through kinship but through sight, through the mirror of flesh. What happens to a species that sees itself this clearly? It begins to imagine, to project, to wonder. Because when you can see the pain on another's skin, you begin to remember it on your own. When you witness hunger, fever, joy, desire, not through scent or posture alone, but through the flush of skin, the tremble of limbs, the tears that leave streaks on a naked cheek, something changes. The boundary between self and other softens, bare skin becomes a shared surface, and shared surfaces give rise to shared stories. From the heat of the savannah to the chill of the mountains, the naked body continued its silent conversation with the world. But no longer was it a passive recipient. It became an agent, a signal, a declaration. We covered it, painted it, scarred it, adorned it. From ochre smeared on Paleolithic faces to tattoos inked with obsidian shards, the body became a canvas of culture, a narrative surface. But it began with absence, with the missing fur, with the quiet disappearance of what once had been assumed eternal. 1.5 million years ago, this transformation was not dramatic. There was no sudden unveiling, just a slow erosion of hair, follicle by follicle, skin cell by skin cell. And yet, through that slow unfurling, the world received a new kind of primate, one who did not hide beneath a coat, but stood exposed, radiant, awkward. Beautiful, fragile, capable, is this not the essence of humanity? To risk exposure in pursuit of survival, to lose something ancient in order to gain something uncertain. The bare shadow that began to fall across the landscape was not only a physical outline, it was a philosophical one, a metaphor for the very path we would take as a species, out of the forest, into the open, from concealment to revelation, from instinct to intention. It is easy now to take it for granted, to forget that nakedness is unusual, that no other primate followed this path, that we alone stood up, shed our coats, and walked directly into the light. But deep within our biology, and deeper still in our mythologies, this moment echoes. It is not merely the story of a change in skin, it is the story of how vulnerability became strength, how absence became identity, how the body became a message, and that message continues still, in every touch, in every glance, in every act of tenderness, of cruelty, of art. Our bare skin remembers. It carries the ancient sun. It carries the hunt. It carries the sweat, the wounds, the signals. It carries the memory of fur and the promise of what replaced it. So when you ask, why are we hairless, you're not asking a question about anatomy. You are asking what it means to be human, and that is the shadow we all carry. The bare shadow, quiet, shimmering, unforgettable. What happens to a species that sees itself this clearly? It begins to imagine, to project, to wonder, and then, inevitably, it begins to adapt, not only to itself, but to a world that no longer resembles the one it was born into. 1.6 million years ago, East Africa was changing. Not gently, not gradually, but with the grinding force of tectonic breath. A new world was being carved out in fire and dust, a crucible that would shape not only the landscape, but the body, the breath, the skin of our ancestors. Forests were dying, not all at once, but steadily, like shadows receding at dawn. The thick, humid canopies that once cloaked the equatorial earth began to fragment into islands of green surrounded by oceans of golden grass. Rainfall patterns shifted, dry seasons lengthened, the trees thinned, the air grew hotter, and what once had been a sanctuary became a threshold. The creatures that once swung and climbed through branches now stood at the edge of emptiness, staring into the great openness of the savannah. And what did they see? Endless visibility. Little shade, the constant risk of being seen, and the equal risk of seeing too much. The forest had hidden danger, but the savannah exposed it. Predators became silhouettes against the horizon. Herds became waves of movement across the dry plain. Time itself began to move differently in this new theatre. Longer, hotter days, cooler, restless nights. The rhythms of the world had shifted, and with them, the bodies that moved through it. It was in this world that Homo erectus emerged. Not born exactly, evolution does not deal in clear beginnings, but revealed, as if sculpted by the hands of drought and distance. Taller than their predecessors, slimmer, more efficient, built not for leaping from limb to limb, but for walking, endlessly, tirelessly, across the baking earth. They did not sprint like cats or gallop like antelope. They endured. Their strides were long, their frames economical, their minds already deepening, attentive to pattern, to motion, to change. And their skin was different. Why? Because the savannah did not forgive heat. A body wrapped in fur under that equatorial sun would boil from within. Sweat would collect beneath the hair, offering little help and much harm. But a hairless body, or one on the path toward hairlessness, could release heat with ruthless efficiency, evaporate it, breathe through the pores, use the skin as a cooling engine, even as the world around it shimmered with thermal threat. Was this the moment where sweating became salvation? When the body stopped merely reacting to heat and began using it, surviving through it, thriving because of it? And if so, was it the world that sculpted the skin, or the skin that dared to meet the world halfway? Because in a landscape of fire and dust, only the body that could carry the sun within it could walk forward. And so they did, step by deliberate step, crossing a continent that was no longer the soft cradle of their arboreal ancestors, but a vast, open expanse that demanded a new kind of courage. This courage was not loud. It did not roar or bare its teeth. It lived instead in the quiet insistence of the body, in muscles tuned for distance, in lungs that learned to draw slow, enduring breaths, in skin that shimmered with determination under the punishing glare of an unforgiving sky. The Pleistocene did not merely introduce heat, it introduced instability. The earth tilted through cycles, wet phases gave way to dry phases, lakes expanded and then retreated, leaving salt flats and cracked earth behind. Rivers wandered like restless serpents, abandoning old channels and carving new ones. Every shift forced life to adapt. Trees could not run, but hominins could walk. And what is walking, if not a soft refusal to surrender? The forests continued their slow collapse, not violently but inevitably, as climates oscillated between abundance and scarcity. Leaves fell earlier each season, branches grew brittle. The great fruit-bearing giants that once sustained entire communities of apes dwindled. Those who clung to the trees found themselves trapped in shrinking geometries of shade. But those who watched the horizon, who dared to imagine survival somewhere beyond the last patch of forest, began to move. Is this how a lineage transforms? Not through choice, but through hunger. Picture the first of them stepping out from the green edge into the brightness, the air sharper, the ground hotter, the grass whispering in long strokes against their legs, the sky impossibly wide. Their bodies must have felt exposed, even overwhelmed. Yet something kept them moving. Something older than fear. Something older than language. A biological imperative that nudged them toward opportunity dressed as danger. And all around them, the world responded. Predators adapted to the openness. Lions sprawled across termite mounds, scanning for movement. Hyenas patrolled the edges of dried riverbeds. Eagles circled overhead, riding the thermals that rippled upward from the heated ground. Prey animals formed ever larger herds. Their survival hinged on cooperation and watchfulness. This was a world where visibility ruled, where survival belonged not to the strongest but to the most perceptive. What kind of creature thrives in a world that cannot be hidden from? Homo erectus, with their long legs and upright posture, could see farther, could anticipate danger before it arrived, could track the shifting silhouettes of prey even when the landscape played tricks with light and illusion. Their brains grew to interpret movement, to predict patterns, to remember where water once was, and might be again after the next rain. And then there was the heat, always the heat. The wind carried dust. The sun sculpted shade into a rare and precious currency. To spend too much time exposed was to risk collapse. But to leave the forest flush behind, they needed a new strategy, one written into their pores, their blood, their skin itself. Sweat became more than a response. It became a philosophy, a way of existing in defiance of the world's furnace, a device that allowed the body to release the sun's burden drop by shimmering drop. But this adaptation belonged only to the body that embraced its bareness. And so the question lingers, did the savannah strip away the fur, or did the emerging nakedness invite the savannah to become home? What happens when the environment reshapes the flesh, and the flesh reshapes the environment in return? The answer, as always, is not singular. It unfolds across centuries, across generations. Evolution is not a conversation. It is an echo. It is not a design, but a drift, shaped by pressure, by opportunity, by the unforgiving hands of climate and hunger. The Pleistocene, with its rhythmic chaos, gave no mercy and no margin for error. It offered only one constant: change. And in the midst of this, Homo erectus persisted. They moved across regions that today form Ethiopia, Kenya, and Tanzania, lands that once held forests, then mosaics of woodland and grassland, and finally open savanna. We find their footprints not in stone tools alone, but in the very sediment that drank their sweat. Their presence is written into the volcanic tuff, into the eroded channels where water once ran. They were there when the rain withdrew. They were there when the grass grew tall and brittle. They were there when fire danced across the land. Yes, fire, a companion and a threat. Lightning strikes, in the absence of moisture, became arsonists. Fields ignited, animals fled, and the scent of smoke became as familiar as the scent of rain once was. Some researchers believe that Homo erectus was among the first to tame this phenomenon, not to create fire from nothing perhaps, but to harness it when it appeared, to carry embers, to feed the flames, to draw circles of warmth and safety into the darkened nights. Is it a coincidence that nakedness and fire seem to walk together? Fur protects against chill, but in the absence of fur, warmth must be summoned, must be maintained. Fire became skin surrogate, not just for cooking, though that too would come, but for survival, for sleeping beneath the stars without succumbing to the cold, for keeping predators at bay, for watching each other's bodies by firelight, interpreting their twitches and breaths, sensing things words had not yet been shaped to carry. And it was under that firelit dome that another transformation took hold. Community. The open world had stripped the forests of their isolating enclosures. It had pulled beings together by necessity. Protection now required numbers, cooperation, shared vigilance. And around those flickering orange cores, something older than speech began to evolve. Memory, observation, intent. The transmission of knowledge not through instinct, but through demonstration. Could it be that the savannah did not just shape the body, but also the bond? That in forcing humans out of the forest and into exposure, it also forced them into each other's care. The ecological crucible that forged Homo erectus did not ask only for resilience. It asked for adaptation on every level: anatomical, behavioural, social. It demanded a skin that could sweat, a brain that could watch, a hand that could carry fire, a foot that could walk not just far but together. And perhaps above all, it asked for a spirit that could endure not only the world's changes, but its own. Because endurance in this context is not simply biological, it is existential. To walk upright under a burning sky is to choose visibility over safety. To sweat into the dust rather than hide in the trees is to risk being seen by predator, by kin, by fate itself. And in that visibility, Homo erectus became something more than a survivor. They became a participant in the shaping of time. But how do we know? How can we draw meaning from a fossilized jaw, a stone flake, the charred remains of an ancient hearth? These are not diaries, they are not confessions, they are fragments. But even fragments tell stories, if we know how to listen. The terrain of East Africa preserves more than bones. It preserves the context in which bones were laid. Sediment layers hold the signature of ancient fires. Ashfall beds mark explosive moments. Trace fossils, a foot pressed into damp volcanic mud, freeze a gesture in mid-stride. One step, one decision. And the shape of that foot matters. The arch, the heel strike, the aligned toes. These are not trivial details. They are clues. They whisper of an animal built for walking, not climbing. For distance, not bursts. For watching the horizon, not scanning the canopy. Homo erectus was leaving behind more than trees. They were leaving behind the past, not deliberately, not with a goal, but inevitably. The world they faced did not reward specialization. It rewarded flexibility, generalism, the ability to shift, to experiment. They scavenged. They hunted, they migrated, and through all of this the climate kept changing. Wet periods would return, but never for long. Aridity always followed. Patterns became rhythms, rhythms became tests, and the test, always, was survival through transformation. In this space, the skin told the story. Human ancestors did not become naked overnight. Hair density would have decreased slowly, across countless generations. Some regions of the body retained their coverage. Others began to open, to the sun, to the air, to others. The eccrine glands, tiny sweat factories that became more numerous, more efficient. A sheen of perspiration across exposed skin turned danger into cooling. Evolution sculpted a new interface between body and world. And what did the world give in return? A canvas of uncertainty, a place where no shelter was guaranteed. Where the very air itself could strip moisture from the lungs, where the pursuit of game might stretch into days, where failure meant not just hunger, but extinction. In this place, every cell mattered, every breath, every drop of water. And yet Homo erectus continued to expand, not just across Africa, but eventually into Eurasia, into lands colder and more treacherous still. Why did they leave? Were they pushed by drought, by dwindling resources, by the slow death of familiar trees? Or were they pulled by something deeper, a restlessness in the body that had already been shaped by movement? A mind that had begun to hold maps, not of territory, but of memory. A will not only to survive, but to search. What happens to a species that walks farther than it needs to? It begins to become something else, not just anatomically, but psychically. A creature shaped by distance learns to anticipate, to imagine. It becomes a planner, a rememberer, a dreamer. Its muscles move through space, but its thoughts move through time. And perhaps that is the quiet revolution sparked by the savannah, not only in the way it reformed the human body, but in how it reoriented the human mind. The world of fire and dust was not a world designed for ease. It was an arena, a proving ground. Trees no longer offered their embrace. Shade had become a flickering privilege, a moment of cool mercy beneath the acacia or the sparse baobab. And so the body hardened, not with armour, but with openness. The skin became the mediator. It cooled the blood, it bore the wind, it absorbed the light, and in doing so, it redefined what a mammal could be. Because sweating is not a minor detail. It is a declaration. To cool by evaporation is to carry your own defence. It is to shed water not as waste, but as wisdom. Eccrine sweat, that thin, salty liquid, marked a turning point in our lineage. No other primate relied on it to the same degree. No other animal combined it with bareness to this extreme. It is, in its quiet way, one of the most human things about us. And like all human things, it comes with a cost. Water, salt, vulnerability. In the absence of shade, dehydration can spiral toward death in a matter of hours. To sweat is to gamble, to exchange safety now for survival later. But it works, and it worked then. It allowed Homo erectus to move when others rested, to hunt in the heat, to walk into the day, not away from it. It allowed them to endure the rhythms of a planet still groaning into its current shape. They moved with fire at their backs and dust at their heels, and what was left behind? Footprints, tools, ash, silence, but also something else, something alive still in us. The body that you inhabit now, wherever you are listening, is shaped by that age. The pores on your skin, the way sweat emerges in tension or heat, the long tendons in your legs, the rhythm of your stride. All of it began there, beneath that sun, among those dying trees, in a world where survival demanded exposure and motion and patience. We often think of evolution as adding a new limb, a better brain, a sharper eye. But sometimes it is subtraction that changes everything. The forest was taken, the fur was lost, the certainty of shelter disappeared, and from that absence came something extraordinary. The emergence of Homo erectus was not simply a step forward. It was a shedding, a stepping out, a revelation. They met the world as it was, harsh, bright, merciless, and they did not retreat. They walked into it, and with each step they became more like us. They walked into it, into the brightness, into the furnace, into a world where heat was not just an obstacle, it was an ever-present presence, relentless and indiscriminate. There, beneath the African sun, Homo erectus did not merely endure the heat, they absorbed it, they danced with it. They learned, over thousands of generations, not to fear the burn but to master the art of staying just below the edge of combustion. Their secret, not tools, not fire, not weapons, but sweat. Sweat. A single word that feels almost mundane now, almost invisible in its familiarity. But it is one of the most radical biological innovations in the story of human survival. And not all sweat is the same. What emerged in the lineage of Homo erectus was a unique and powerful system, a body flooded with eccrine glands, scattered not in small patches, but across nearly the entire surface of the skin. Tiny, tireless mechanisms of moisture and salt, pumping steadily to keep the core cool while the outer world baked. No other primate possesses this system so completely. Chimpanzees, our closest cousins, sweat too, but their primary cooling method lies in panting. Their bodies, covered in insulating hair, trap heat in ways that prevent long-distance effort under the sun. For them, heat means stillness, shade, caution. But for Homo erectus, heat became a resource, a force to be negotiated, outlasted, used. How did this shift occur? Not through sudden revolution, but through the slow arithmetic of pressure. The ones who cooled faster could move longer. The ones who moved longer could feed, could flee, could survive. Over time, the equation rewrote the body. Hair thinned, eccrine glands multiplied. The cardiovascular system stretched itself to support the rhythm of this new internal engine. It was not simply that Homo erectus could endure heat. It was that they could sustain motion under it. A slow, steady, impossible motion. One step, then another. Then another. Endurance hunting was born, not in strategy or speech, but in sweat. Picture it. The sun at its zenith, shimmering over the grasses. Antelope graze at a cautious distance. Then they bolt. But the humans do not rush. They follow, walking, jogging, tracking for hours. The prey overheats. It cannot release the thermal build-up fast enough. It slows. The hunters continue, silent, steady. Eventually the antelope collapses, not from a wound, but from exhaustion, and the kill is made. It is easy to overlook this kind of power because it is quiet. It is not a lion's pounce, not a cheetah's sprint. It is the power of continuation, of refusal to stop, and sweat. That invisible shimmer of salt water is the engine. A million tiny vents, exhaling heat so the legs can keep moving. What kind of creature wins not by striking faster, but by cooling more efficiently? And what does that say about us? About the legacy etched not in muscle, but in moisture. It tells us that the architecture of human power was never only about strength or speed, it was about stamina, patience. The willingness to suffer through the long middle of things. We are not apex predators because we are fierce. We are apex predators because we are stubborn, because our bodies learn to shed heat instead of store it, to release the fire rather than be consumed by it. And that shedding happened through sweat. Each droplet is a triumph of evolutionary engineering. As it evaporates, it pulls heat from the skin, not just displacing it, but transforming it. This simple mechanism allowed Homo erectus to stay just below the threshold of collapse, while their prey stumbled into it. It created a margin, a tiny thermal advantage, that repeated over time became a difference between life and death. A physiological razor's edge balanced on the back of salt and breath. But this system is expensive. Equine sweating comes at a price. Water, always precious, is lost with every drop. Electrolytes drain. Dehydration lurks at the margins of effort. In modern terms, we understand this trade-off well. A long run demands rehydration, rest, salts. But imagine this balance in a world without canteens, no bottles, no aid stations, just a dry wind, a vast plain, and the hope of a river not yet reached. To sweat under such conditions is to gamble, to trust that endurance will pay off before exhaustion collects its toll. And so the system came with dependencies. To survive with such a costly cooling method, early humans had to learn not just to move, but to prepare, to find water, to know its locations across seasons, to return to it again and again as the body lost its reserves to the heat. This necessity likely drove cognitive development. The body demanded more from the mind, not in language perhaps, but in memory, in planning, in spatial understanding. Could sweat have helped birth strategy? Compared to other mammals, the human thermoregulatory system is radically decentralized. Dogs pant, horses sweat, but mostly through their flanks. Fur-bearing animals rely on behavior, shade-seeking, burrowing, stillness, to survive extreme temperatures. But Homo erectus developed a mobile cooling system. The skin itself became active, intelligent, adaptive. Blood vessels rose near the surface, radiating warmth. Pores dilated. The body pulsed with a rhythm meant for motion. This did something more than cool the body. It changed how the body could be used. Now the human frame was not limited by the brief bursts of energy seen in other predators. It could sustain effort across hours, even days, and this capacity unlocked new territories, new prey, new rhythms of life. No longer confined to narrow feeding windows or shaded paths, early humans began to explore the open world in ways other animals could not. What happens when an animal learns to outlast the landscape? When the heat, instead of stopping the hunt, becomes part of its logic? It becomes an animal that doesn't just move through the world, it begins to shape its rhythms. And when that animal is human, it begins to build culture around those rhythms. Imagine what it meant, in the time of Homo erectus, to wake with the sunrise not as a warning, but as a signal. The hours that felled most creatures with exhaustion were the very hours that invited the hunter forward. The sun did not deter, it directed. Endurance hunting was more than a strategy. It was a daily ritual, a biological ceremony performed through skin and breath. It required not just bodies capable of cooling themselves, but a collective intuition, a way of reading heat, time, terrain, and prey. The animal being hunted did not collapse all at once. It faltered gradually. And Homo erectus had to sense that faltering, pace it, sink to it. It was not a chase, it was a negotiation, a test of patience sculpted into physiology. And underneath it all, the eccrine glands never rested. Each one, among the 2 to 4 million scattered across the body, operated like a tiny gatekeeper, releasing droplets in response to internal heat. But their placement mattered. Unlike most mammals, humans sweat almost everywhere, from the forehead to the soles of the feet. It is not localized. It is total. This creates a surface-wide cooling effect that no other primate possesses. And with this system came a paradox. The more vulnerable the skin became to sun, to abrasion, to damage, the more powerful it became as an interface for endurance. So what kind of balance was struck? A balance where the skin became both liability and superpower. A body that could collapse under dehydration, yet outlast almost any animal in pure distance. A form that had lost its insulation, but gained a mobility that rewrote its ecological role. Homo erectus, walking beneath the equatorial blaze, became something new. A predator of patience, a being whose very survival depended on internal moderation. This is not how we usually imagine power. We imagine claws, strength, fury. But what if real power is the ability to continue? To carry the heat without faltering? What if dominance is measured not by the kill, but by the kilometers? And what if this shift, this quiet biological gamble on sweat and skin, began to shape more than behavior? Because once a body can move farther, endure longer, recover better, it begins to see farther too. It begins to look beyond the horizon and wonder what lies there. It begins to remember where water once was and where it might be again. And slowly, almost invisibly, the capacity to cool the body becomes the foundation for something even more human. The capacity to imagine. It begins not in language or art, but in movement, in planning, in endurance. When Homo erectus learned to sweat efficiently, it wasn't merely adapting to heat. It was learning to survive in anticipation of the future, because sweating is preemptive. It begins before overheating occurs. It requires the body to monitor itself, to anticipate what's coming, to respond before it's too late. In this way, thermoregulation through the skin mirrors a deeper cognitive function, foresight. And foresight changes everything. To cool proactively is to behave as though the future matters. It's a form of primitive prediction, encoded not in conscious thought, but in physiology. And as Homo erectus followed their prey across the savannah, guided not by speed but by the subtle clues of animal fatigue and environmental cues, their bodies pulsing with evaporative efficiency, the mind began to follow the body's lead. Strategy emerged not from abstraction, but from sweat. But how does our sweating compare to that of other animals? The contrast is profound. Most mammals do not sweat at all. Cats lick themselves, spreading saliva to cool. Dogs pant, exchanging heat through their breath and tongues. Horses come closest, sweating visibly along their bodies, though even they lack the skin-wide distribution that humans possess. Primates, our closest relatives, perspire through apocrine glands, those associated with hair follicles, and their eccrine glands are few, limited mostly to the palms and soles. Only humans evolved to turn the entire skin into a cooling canvas. This adaptation allowed the body to become a moving engine, one that could operate in the most thermally demanding environments on Earth. But to make that possible, hair had to thin. Fur had to disappear. Without that, the sweat would trap, saturate, and suffocate. Cooling wouldn't happen. Efficiency would be lost. So the shift to sweating was not isolated. It was intertwined with nakedness, with pigmentation, with the very fabric of who we would become, and all of it came with a steep cost. Because for every drop of sweat shed in service of endurance, hydration had to be replenished. And so early humans became bound to the landscape's offerings, to springs, to rivers, to rainfall, to the knowledge of where and when these elements appeared. In this way, sweating forged not only endurance but dependence, a tether to the land, to its patterns, to the cycles of wet and dry that governed the African continent. Did the memory of water shape the birth of memory itself? And what happens when the body cannot cool? When the air is too humid, when water is too far, when the gamble fails? Then sweat turns against us. Dehydration sets in. Electrolytes drop. Muscles cramp. The same system that makes us powerful also makes us perilous. This too is part of our story, that we survive on the edge, that even our strengths must be carefully managed, that to carry the heat within us is both a privilege and a risk. Because the heat never really leaves. Even now, in the bodies we inhabit today, and the glisten of skin after a run, the salt left behind on clothes, the flush of cheeks after effort, we are reliving that ancient dance between fire and flesh. Our ancestors may be gone, but their adaptations remain written into our biology. The same systems that allowed Homo erectus to walk across continents are alive in us, quietly regulating, constantly responding. We rarely think of sweat as sacred, but perhaps we should. It is the water of survival summoned from within. It is our inheritance from a time when the world was hotter, drier, more unforgiving. It is the soft signal that we're alive, not just breathing, but enduring, adapting, evolving. And in a strange way, it is a language the body still speaks, fluently, even when the mind is quiet. The skin listens, the glands open, the droplets fall. And in those moments, we are not far from the savannah. We are not far from the long chases, the patient tracks, the still dawns before the hunt. We are not far from the world that demanded this gift from us, that asked our bodies to solve the puzzle of the sun, and in solving it, to become something new. Sweating, then, is not merely a detail of physiology. It is the signature of an animal that chose to face the heat rather than hide from it. It is the legacy of creatures who walked further, stayed longer, and outlasted the burn. And that choice, to shed the fur, to trust the skin, to gamble on evaporation, is a quiet miracle. One that did not make us superhuman, but made us human. Even today, that system shapes what we do, how we work, how we move, how we survive. And yet, like so many great adaptations, it hides in plain sight. We forget how strange it is, how special, but in the grand scheme of life on Earth, we are the sweaty ones, the hairless apes who cool from within, the marathoners of evolution. In the next chapter, we'll look deeper into the skin itself, not just as a tool for thermoregulation, but as a landscape, a canvas shaped by climate, colour, sensation, and time. Because once the fur fell away, the naked body faced something new, exposure. And with that exposure came another story, the story of touch, of sun, of shade, of skin. What kind of creature walks into the world without armour? No claws, no fur, no hardened plates, no thick hide, just skin, soft, exposed, and silent. The human body, once stripped of its fur, entered the theatre of evolution naked and bright under the sun. It is one of the great paradoxes of our lineage, that in the midst of a dangerous world, one species chose vulnerability, and not by accident, not as a mistake or a regression, but as a gamble, a transformation, a quiet rebellion against the standard script of survival. Because nakedness is not just a lack of hair, it is a revelation, a shift from protection to exposure. For the mammal that once huddled in the trees, fur was more than warmth. It was shield, camouflage, barrier. When that fell away, what remained was a body suddenly visible to predators, to parasites, to the elements, to each other. And in that exposure, a new chapter began. What must it have felt like for the first of our ancestors to step out into the open sun, their bodies no longer hidden beneath the soft armour of hair? Without fur, the skin bears the burden. Every abrasion, every insect bite, every thorn becomes personal. Infection waits in the smallest cut. Sunburn scorches the surface, and with it, the slow erosion of tissue, the creeping risk of cancer, of heat stroke, of dehydration. To be hairless is to be constantly negotiating with danger, a creature balanced on the edge of damage. So why take that risk? One answer lies not in the sun, but in what crawls beneath it. Parasites, fleas, lice, ticks. The silent invaders of furred mammals. Hair may protect from sun and abrasion, but it is also a haven for pests, for bloodsuckers and disease bearers. Once Homo erectus moved into the heat of open savannahs, parasite load may have become a new enemy, and in that war, bare skin offered an advantage. It is easier to see, easier to groom. A single insect is no longer hidden in a jungle of strands. It is visible, vulnerable. This is the strange logic of evolution, that by removing one form of protection, we might build another. But protection was only half the story, because once the skin is revealed, something else becomes possible. Communication, expression, the subtle language of blood beneath the surface, of flushing, paling, sweating. A living canvas on which emotion, arousal, fear, health, and truth could be painted in real time. Nakedness invited the eyes of others not just to judge, but to interpret. It was no longer just about survival in the face of lions or sun. It was about survival in the presence of each other. And that presence, that gaze, begins to change everything. What happens when the body becomes a message? When skin is no longer barrier but signal, and when the cost of exposure becomes the beginning of a new kind of power? It is then that vulnerability shifts from weakness to weapon. Because when your body speaks before your mouth does, when your skin tells the truth of your condition, your hunger, your arousal, your fear, you enter a new kind of social world. One where transparency is not optional, where intentions are painted directly onto flesh. And from that nakedness comes a new form of survival, social cohesion. The human body, once bared by evolution, became not just a thing that functioned, but a thing that signalled. We see it even now, the blush of embarrassment, the pallor of fear, the flush of exertion. These are not accidents, they are biological broadcasts, honest, involuntary signs that bypass language entirely. And in early human societies they would have mattered. In a species that increasingly depended on cooperation, for hunting, for parenting, for defending territory, the ability to read one another became critical. Fur obscures, skin reveals. And in this revealing, early hominins may have developed new pressures, not just to survive the elements, but to manage appearances, to present health, to attract, to avoid suspicion, to inspire trust. Nakedness turned the body into a screen, and others became its audience. This feedback loop of signalling and reading, of revealing and responding, may have laid the groundwork for the complex emotional intelligence that would come to define our species. But the stakes were still high, because the sun never relented. Parasites were only part of the threat. Exposure brought its own dangers: ultraviolet radiation, cuts, abrasions, heat stroke. The thin epidermis of a hairless primate was constantly vulnerable, and yet it was also repairable. Skin heals, it regenerates. Perhaps in exchange for fur's protection, evolution gave us a new kind of resilience: regenerative skin, responsive immunity, darker pigmentation to shield against solar damage. Indeed, as fur vanished, melanin surged. Pigmentation wasn't just aesthetic, it was armor, a layer of chemical defense built cell by cell to filter sunlight, to slow the damage of rays, to protect the genetic code beneath. In this way, the loss of fur wasn't a surrender, it was a trade, a shift from passive insulation to active modulation, from hiding the body to managing it. This constant negotiation between weakness and strength, risk and adaptation, became the signature of our evolution. To be human was to be unfinished, always in flux, always adapting to the tension between what we lost and what we gained, between softness and strength. And nowhere was this more visible than on the skin. Because once the skin became message and medium, the story of our species changed. It was no longer just a tale of muscles and tools. It became a tale of signals, of trust, of how bodies bare to the world began to form bonds, not in spite of their exposure but because of it. Nakedness, once the mark of fragility, was recast as an invitation to closeness, to empathy, to observation. In furred mammals, much of social information is hidden. Scent dominates. Subtle shifts in posture, glance, or touch are filtered through a veil of hair. But in the hairless hominin, the whole body becomes a site of interaction. The flicker of a muscle, the sheen of sweat, the rise and fall of breath. Each moment becomes visible, legible. The surface becomes story. And this visibility is not just for others. It changes how the self is felt. To touch bare skin is different than to touch through fur. It is direct, immediate. Infants, born helpless and hairless, require warmth, contact, skin-to-skin regulation, and so the absence of fur amplifies the need for physical intimacy. It shapes parenting, bonding, affection. To be hairless is to be haptically present. To need others, not abstractly but bodily. This may seem like a softness in the evolutionary tale, but it's not. Because survival was no longer only about avoiding predators. It was about joining collectives. Cooperative hunting, food sharing, shared childcare. These weren't luxuries. They were strategies. Nakedness may have encouraged these behaviours by creating a species more sensitive to the cues of others, more attuned, more communicative through posture, complexion, eye contact. As hair vanished, social intelligence surged, but still the danger remained. A body without fur is an open question to the world. It asks, can you protect yourself another way? And Homo erectus answered with tools, with fire, with planning. Technology began to do what hair once had: shelter the body, regulate its warmth, deter its enemies. In this sense, the loss of fur may have been one of the earliest nudges toward external solutions. To invent clothing is to acknowledge exposure. To wield fire is to reshape the climate around you. Each step was a reply to the naked condition, but these replies did not erase the body's new role. Even under a pelt or beside a flame, the human skin remained a screen of truths. And perhaps the greatest of these truths was this: that nakedness could unify, that to be exposed is to be seen, and that in being seen, in all your fragility and sweat and colour, you might also be understood. In that understanding, predators became less frightening. Because the group was watching, the others were close, eyes met, hands touched. Trust, fragile and physical, emerged from bare surfaces, and so, against all odds, exposure became a kind of defence. Not of tooth and claw, but of presence, of visibility, of contact, of becoming the animal that dared to reveal itself, and survived. It is not the kind of power we're used to celebrating. It does not roar. It does not tower. It does not intimidate by size or stealth. Instead, it endures by being readable, predictable, known. And in the world of early humans, where danger still stalked the tall grasses and heat, beat down without mercy, this predictability became a currency. If others could see your pain, your fatigue, your strength, they could respond, assist, warn, or challenge. And so the hairless body became more than a thermoregulatory machine. It became a social interface. Even aggression changed. Among many mammals, fights are lethal because signals are missed or misread. With fur gone, human ancestors developed visible tension in the face, in the jaw, in the flush of skin. A bare face can communicate disapproval. A bare chest can puff with pride or sink in submission. Conflict could be averted, diffused, rehearsed. And over time, such subtlety may have spared lives, may have made tribes more stable, families more durable. But visibility also made the body beautiful, or at least made beauty something to be recognized. Sexual selection entered the stage. In many species, elaborate displays evolve not for survival, but for attraction. Peacocks, antlers, plumage. In humans, the canvas of skin offered something different. Not adornment, but expression. Youth, fertility, health. These became visible, especially in bare skin. Coloration, clarity, symmetry. These signs weren't added, they were revealed, and so, nakedness may have sharpened the lens of desire. To be hairless was to be chosen or passed over, not just for strength, but for subtle signs of resilience, of calm, of fertility. In this way, human skin evolved under the twin pressures of nature and culture, of climate and closeness, of the need to survive and the need to be seen. Yet with this visibility came danger of a different kind: injury, infection, scar tissue, skin diseases. Without fur, the cost of a single wound grew higher. Every scrape was a question of immunity, every bite an invitation to bacteria. In a landscape without antibiotics, without antiseptics, healing was never guaranteed. And so, the evolution of skin wasn't just about resilience. It was about surveillance, the constant watching of wounds, the quiet rituals of care, grooming, licking, touching, behaviours seen across primates, likely intensified in early humans as a way to manage this new vulnerability. We became caretakers of the body, not just our own, but each other's. And in doing so, we moved closer still. Nakedness demanded cooperation, hygiene, tenderness. It taught us to notice, to attend, to touch, not just for warmth or mating, but for healing. And slowly these behaviours stitched themselves into culture. From exposure came not only survival, but story. The story of what it means to be watched, and to watch back, to be both hunter and helper, both danger and grace, to be in every moment both predator and prey. It's a paradox we still carry, etched into every inch of skin. This duality of power through softness, of survival through exposure, did not end in the savannah. It followed us into huts, into myths, into mirrors. Even now we negotiate the terms of our nakedness, when to show, when to cover, who sees, and what they see. The bare body is no longer only a biological fact, it is a cultural negotiation. But before it became a symbol or a taboo, it was a tool, a risky, radiant tool, and it was forged in the fire of Pleistocene sun, tempered by wind and grit, and cooled in the shadows of early human kinship. We tend to think of clothing as the great divider, the point at which we became civilized. But it was the loss of fur, that first great shedding, that truly marked our divergence. We became the animal that faced the elements not with hair but with heat, not with armour but with awareness. Every evolutionary gamble carries costs. There was pain, suffering. The weak did not always survive, but enough did. And they passed forward a legacy not of invincibility, but of adaptation. We may not be the strongest or the fastest, but we became the most responsive, the most cooperative, the most communicative. Nakedness was not our fall from grace. It was the beginning of grace. It taught us to trust what cannot be hidden, to read what is not spoken, to tend to what is broken. The bare skin became a mirror, and in it we saw not just others, but ourselves. And from that self-recognition emerged empathy, intimacy, culture, law, art, the first touch, the first wound, the first gesture of care. None of it required words, just presence, just contact. This is the inheritance we walk with. Whether wrapped in wool or beneath fluorescent lights, the structure remains. Beneath every jacket is a body evolved for openness, and with that openness, the endless risk of being seen, but also the endless possibility of being understood. We are still the animals who survived through softness, still the creatures who faced lions not with claws, but with signals, with rhythm, with sweat, with eyes that mirrored each other's fear. And slowly we turn that fear into firelight, into families, into language, into trust. What began as a question of skin became a story of meaning. In the next chapter we will follow this story deeper, into colour itself, into the evolutionary poetry of pigmentation, where biology meets geography, and the spectrum of human skin begins to tell its ancient tale. Because once the fur was gone and the sun bore down, the body responded in waves of melanin and memory, and the colour of survival began to bloom. They did not kill with claws. They did not pounce from trees. They did not match the gazelle in speed or the lion in force, and yet they hunted across the grasslands of East Africa, beneath a sun so relentless it could peel the breath from your chest. They hunted with silence, with sweat, with time. What kind of creature becomes a predator by being patient? What kind of body must you inhabit to turn slowness into strength? Somewhere between 1 and 2 million years ago, something extraordinary happened. Homo erectus stepped onto the open plains and became, perhaps for the first time in history, an endurance hunter. The body had already begun to change. Long limbs for stride, enlarged gluteal muscles for stabilization, a new suite of eccrine sweat glands now humming across nearly every patch of exposed skin. But it was not just the body that changed. It was the very tempo of the hunt. Imagine it. The morning sun rises on the savannah. A herd of antelope grazes, twitching with every scent. In the distance, a group of bipedal figures waits. They are slow, unimpressive, unarmed. And yet, as the day begins to warm, they follow. Not quickly, not with drama, but relentlessly. The first chase is not about catching. It is about marking. The prey flees, the humans follow. The antelope rests, the humans appear again. Over and over, no moment of escape ever lasts. And all the while the humans sweat. Where most mammals pant, humans perspire. Panting works well in bursts, a method of releasing heat through the mouth after short, intense sprints. But it fails under endurance. The mouth must pause to drink, to breathe, to move. Sweating, however, is continuous, uninterrupted. The skin becomes a cooling engine, shedding heat across the entire body surface, drawing internal fire out through a shimmer of salt. This was not an accident. It was an innovation. The evolution of hairlessness, coupled with the proliferation of sweat glands, created a physiological revolution. It allowed our ancestors to keep moving when others had to stop, to push forward while their prey collapsed from heat and exhaustion. But what kind of mind hunts like this? What kind of intelligence does it take to follow a single animal, step by step, across 10 miles of open terrain, tracking prints, droppings, heat patterns, memory, for hours? This was not brute force. This was cognition, spatial memory, strategy. The hunt became a moving puzzle, one that required not only vision but patience, endurance, and above all, commitment. Once the chase began, there was no turning back, no second wind. It was predator and prey bound together in a spiral of attrition. One losing water, the other leaking sweat, one slowing, the other steady. This was the silent hunt, a weapon forged not from stone or bone but from discipline, and the body became the blade, not sharp like a fang, not curved like a claw, but honed by repetition, precision, and rhythm. Persistence hunting was not about the moment of the kill. It was about everything that came before, the hours of tracking, the tuning of breath to pace, the fine-tuned listening not just to hoofbeats or wind, but to your own fatigue. To hunt like this was to know your limits and then outlast them. It was to become part of the heat itself, to lean into the landscape, into the long silence of the savannah, and to move with a tempo slow enough to be ignored, fast enough to close the distance, constant enough to never let go. And so, the hairless body, drenched in sweat, became invisible in a new way, not by hiding in shadow, but by refusing to stop. Prey, when stalked by a lion, is prepared for a sprint, for a flash of death. But when stalked by the sweat-drenched upright walker who never disappears, it becomes confused. The rules change. Panic becomes exhaustion. Fear becomes overheating. Muscles cramp. Legs fail. And in that final moment, not of struggle, but surrender, the human emerges, calm, breathing steadily, ready. This was not the only kind of hunting in prehistory, of course, but it may have been among the first truly human ones. It required no traps, no arrows, just eyes, skin, sweat, and the will to move when everything else stood still. What's more astonishing is that echoes of this behaviour still exist. Among the Kalahari San of southern Africa and the Raramuri runners of northern Mexico, among certain Aboriginal groups and East African pastoralists, persistence hunting has been observed, recorded and studied. In these communities, hunters will pursue antelope, kudu, or ostrich for hours across sun-scorched plains. They rely on knowledge of animal movement, on reading subtle changes in gait or hoofprint, and above all, on endurance. And what allows that endurance is not just muscle or mindset, it's cooling. Without effective thermoregulation, the body fails, muscles overheat, the brain misfires. But sweating, consistent, effective sweating, allows core temperatures to remain stable even under extreme effort. And for that sweat to work, fur had to go. Air must reach skin. Water must evaporate. The naked body becomes a wick for its own survival. This isn't passive, it's active, strategic. Evolution didn't simply remove fur, it transformed the body into a hunting system, a heat-powered, time-driven, moisture-balanced pursuit engine. And perhaps most quietly of all, it changed the nature of what hunting even meant. No longer an act of brute violence, but a test of resolve. A contest not of teeth, but of lungs, not of ambush, but of attention. To be human in this context was not to dominate through terror, it was to endure through silence, and in that silence, to become the last animal moving. There is something deeply eerie about that image, a herd long gone, a landscape emptied of sound, and one figure upright, glistening, steady, still walking, not chasing anymore, just closing the final gap. The prey lies ahead, staggering now, body overheating, instincts confused. It was never caught by surprise. It was not tricked. It was simply outlasted. Persistence hunting in this way becomes a kind of meditation, a dialogue between body and earth, between lungs and distance, between heat and resolve. And this dialogue shaped the human form, everything from our long Achilles tendons, storing and releasing energy like a spring, to the large gluteal muscles that stabilize the pelvis during upright locomotion, to the arch of the human foot, designed not for climbing trees, but for absorbing impact and launching forward, all speak to a life spent on the move. The body became a narrative of pursuit. But it was the skin, again, that made this story possible. We often think of the brain as the defining organ of humanity, and in many ways it is. But the skin tells a different story. The skin is not just the boundary between self and world. It's a communication channel, a regulator, a warning system, a cooling surface, a social canvas. In the hunt, it becomes the engine of survival. As internal heat rises from exertion, sweat glands activate, releasing moisture across the skin. As that moisture evaporates, it draws heat out of the body. But for this to work efficiently, fur cannot be present. Hair traps moisture, inhibits airflow. Evolution made a decision: lose the coat, gain the chase. And it worked. Yet there were costs. Sweat requires water. Constant sweating demands constant hydration. In hot environments, early humans were at risk of dehydration long before they were at risk of predation. This meant locating water sources, storing knowledge of seasonal streams, even transporting water in primitive containers. Behaviours that suggest not only physical adaptation, but growing cultural complexity. The hunt was never just physical, it was cognitive, social, coordinated. It required memory, teamwork, planning. And at its centre was a body stripped of protection but enhanced with potential, a body that traded insulation for information. That became more readable, more flexible, more open to the world. Fossils whisper of this change. The limb proportions of Homo erectus, longer legs, shorter arms, hint at life on the move. The narrowing of the pelvis, the structure of the inner ear for balance, the shape of the rib cage for efficient breathing, all speak of distance, of stamina, of commitment. This is not the evolution of the ambush predator. This is the evolution of the marathon predator. And at every step, the skin shimmers, not just with salt and sun, but with the memory of movement, with the story of a species that learned to turn slowness into strategy, sweat into survival, to become not the fastest, but the most enduring thing alive, and in doing so, to become something new. Because in the long chase, something more than biology was forged, something human, not just in the body, but in the story of the body. The persistence hunt was not just a survival strategy, it was a ritual, a performance, a lived myth of stamina, and like all rituals, it shaped how we saw the world and how we saw ourselves. In the heart of this slow pursuit, identity began to shift. No longer merely animals responding to stimuli, early humans began to act with intention that spanned hours, perhaps even days. That kind of time consciousness, of planning beyond the moment, was different from anything the savannah had seen before. It required communication, coordination, trust. In a persistence hunt, no one succeeds alone. Even the best runner cannot track a scattered herd across shifting ground without help. And so, as the skin adapted to cool, the brain adapted to connect. Groups had to work in synchrony, tracking, relaying positions, reading signals across great distances, a flick of the wrist, a glance, a vocalization. Over time, such interactions may have laid the foundation for symbolic thought, for language, for story. The prey was not simply an animal anymore, it was a lesson. Each successful hunt contained information. Where the animal ran, how it tired, what terrain favoured the chase. This knowledge could be shared, improved, taught. The hunt became intergenerational, The old taught the young learned by running. And in this passage culture emerged. Persistence hunting, then, was not only about meat, it was about meaning. And still, at the centre of it all, the naked skin, unassuming, vulnerable, but utterly efficient. We often think of vulnerability as weakness, but the hairless human body turned that idea inside out. To be exposed was to be functional. To be soft was to be adaptive. Nakedness didn't make humans fragile. It made them fast in a slow, deliberate way. It made them able to suffer, to regulate, to remain in motion long after others collapsed. And when they finally did stop, when the animal fell and the hunt ended, it was not only with victory but with transformation. The hunter had changed. The group had changed. Something had been proven, not just about physical ability but about resolve. The animal is caught, yes, but more importantly, the hunters have endured. And this endurance, this capacity to keep going, became a virtue, one that would echo far beyond the savannah, into migration, into agriculture, into exploration, into all the ways that humans would eventually stretch across the planet, not in sudden leaps, but in measured, persistent footsteps. The silent hunt was practice for everything that would come later. And perhaps that's why it still haunts us. Why marathon running remains a human obsession. Why sweat is still seen as a badge of effort. Why endurance, even now, defines our stories. In sports, in struggle, in survival. Because in every long effort, we echo them. Every run that pushes past the threshold. Every labour that extends into the night. Every journey measured not in speed, but in resolve. It's all a resonance of that ancient choreography, of bodies built not to blaze but to endure, not to dominate but to remain, and in that remaining to reshape the world. There is a quiet dignity in this kind of survival. It doesn't roar, it doesn't dazzle, it hums, low, persistent, undeniable, just like the sweat sliding down the back of an early hunter, just like the footfall against dry earth, over and over again, until even the wind stops to listen. Persistence hunting taught us the geometry of patience, the physics of heat, the psychology of prey. It asked us to become both scientist and artist, to read terrain like a map, to sense fatigue in a pattern of hoofbeats, to balance effort against the rhythm of breath, and all of it under the open sky, on bare feet with bare skin. The silent hunt was not a singular event. It was a template, one that would inform so many of the human endeavours that followed, tracking storms across oceans, charting celestial movement, building languages that stretch across generations. Because in the persistence hunt, there is a fundamental faith that if you keep going, even slowly, even in pain, you will arrive. And perhaps more than any tool or fire or fence, that is what defined us. Not that we were the fastest, not that we were the strongest, but that we would not stop, even as the sun blazed, even as the muscles ached. Even as the landscape offered no shelter, we became the animal who turns time into a tactic, the animal who turns heat into a weapon, the animal who turns patience into power. And now, that same body, your body, still carries the legacy, every pore, every gland, every tendon, the ability to move beyond the panic of the moment and into the steadiness of pursuit, the wisdom to let others sprint while you simply continue. You're a descendant of the long chase, and that chase is not over. It reappears in every endurance test we face, personal, planetary, emotional. It asks us, again and again, will you keep going? Will you keep moving toward the thing that matters, even when it is far, even when it resists, even when no one sees? That is the question we inherited from hairless ancestors beneath a sunlit sky. And in the next chapter, we move from motion to memory, from the mechanics of skin to the map upon it. Because after the sweat and after the hunt, there is another story, one told in pigment, in shadow, in the deep biology of melanin. We will step into the colour of survival and ask how the body, now bare, now brilliant, began to paint its own protection. For most of mammalian history, survival meant wearing your biology on the outside. Fur was not an accessory, it was armour, against heat, against cold, against parasites, predators, and the piercing curiosity of sunlight. But somewhere along the slow curve of our lineage, something astonishing happened. The fur coat vanished. Not all at once, not dramatically, but gradually. A quiet shedding, a surrender of insulation in favour of exposure. And so we must ask, when did it happen? Why did we choose to bare ourselves to the elements when every other creature clung tighter to its pelt? This is not a story told by bones. There are no fossilised hairs, no stone tools etched with the moment hair fell away. Instead, we look for shadows, in genes, in lice, in the whispered divergences of molecular clocks. The body remembers even when the record is silent. Somewhere in the tangled helix of human DNA, a clock ticks without hands. It's not mechanical, but molecular, based on the slow accumulation of genetic mutations over time. By studying these mutations, scientists have learned to estimate when certain evolutionary changes occurred. And when they turned their attention to the genes responsible for hair, a pattern emerged. A cooling, drying world. A bipedal body beginning to chase rather than flee. And around 1.6 to 2 million years ago, a change. Not in stride or tool use, but in skin. The keratinocytes, those outermost cells of the human epidermis, began to behave differently. Follicles that once bristled with dense guard hairs thinned. Some closed entirely, others retreated into fine, nearly invisible wisps, the vestigial traces of a vanished coat. This wasn't a single mutation, but a suite of changes, driven by pressures both external and internal, heat, motion, parasites, social interaction, each pushing in quiet increments toward a body that sweated rather than bristled, that signalled rather than concealed. But genes alone do not tell time. For that we must turn to smaller companions, ancient, tenacious, and intimately familiar. Lice. These humble parasites, despised and ignored, have unknowingly preserved one of the clearest timestamps in human evolution. You carry their legacy on your scalp and skin, inherited from hosts who lived 1 million years before you were born. Today, humans host 2 distinct types of lice: head lice, which cling to the hairs on our scalp, and pubic lice, which inhabit the coarser, darker hair of the groin. That separation is not merely anatomical, it is chronological. Because these 2 lineages, though both lice, are not sisters, pubic lice, astonishingly, are more closely related to lice that live on gorillas. At some point, our ancestors acquired them, perhaps through shared bedding or close contact, and once they were there, they remained. By studying the genetic differences between these 2 louse lineages, scientists were able to estimate when the split occurred. The answer, roughly 3 million years ago, a time when the human body was no longer a single, unbroken forest of fur, but a patchwork of exposure and coverage. That patchwork would not remain static. It was a signal in transition, a canvas in the making. And the parasites that once crept through a continuous coat were suddenly forced to specialise, to choose their terrain. One stayed above, nesting in the fine remnants of cranial hair that may have been spared not for thermoregulation, but for protection from the blistering sun or biting insects. The other burrowed below, finding shelter in what remained of the thicker curled hair around the groin. What changed in the middle, across the vast landscapes of arms, legs, chest and back, was more profound than mere absence. It was the beginning of something new, a skin that could breathe, sweat and signal, no longer hidden beneath a layer of ancient insulation. But to confirm the timing of this transition, we must turn once again to those unlikely witnesses, lice. If pubic lice diverged from their gorilla-dwelling relatives around 3 million years ago, it implies that there was already a bare zone of skin available to them. A space once filled with dense hair, now suddenly conspicuously exposed. Head lice, meanwhile, seem to have diverged from body lice much more recently, around 70,000 years ago, when humans began to wear clothes. And from this, another insight emerges. Hair loss preceded clothing. The body was bared long before it was rewrapped. What kind of creature steps into the open world stripped of its natural covering? Not a beast, but something else, something on the cusp of becoming human. And we find this moment Not in hair, not in lice, but in posture, in the way the spine arched forward, in the widening of the pelvis, in the angle of the femur. The fossilized remains of Homo erectus, dating back nearly 2 million years, suggest a body built not for trees but for ground, not for hiding but for moving. This new posture was more than skeletal. It was ecological. Standing upright maximized exposure to the wind, reduced the surface area baked by the vertical rays of the midday sun, and freed the hands for tools, for gestures, for stories. But that same uprightness also demanded new strategies for thermoregulation. A vertical body constantly in motion across open savannahs needed to shed heat efficiently, and fur, once a shield, became a burden. So the coat was cast off, slowly, imperfectly, asymmetrically, not by accident, but by necessity. And with each generation, as the hair receded, the skin stepped forward. It became not just a boundary, but a messenger, a place where temperature, touch, infection, and emotion could be read in real time. The body was no longer a sealed envelope, it was becoming a screen. What happens to an animal when its skin becomes its voice, when vulnerability becomes information, when exposure becomes expression? What happens when the coat disappears, and something else must take its place? The answer is not merely physical, it is ecological, social, and symbolic. Without fur, the skin became a biological interface, a liminal membrane where survival strategies shifted from concealment to communication. And this shift, subtle but profound, altered how our ancestors lived and how they were seen. The disappearance of hair did not leave the body defenseless. Instead, it invited a new kind of defense, behavior. Behavior rears faster than evolution. Where the genes take millennia to adapt, the mind adapts in days. And as the skin was exposed to sun and abrasion, to insect bite and microbial risk, the hominin mind began to compensate, seeking shade, smearing mud, covering wounds, learning over time the medicinal properties of plants. Even before the invention of fabric or stitching, the bare human body was already cloaked, not in fur, but in cognition. Still, the physical vulnerabilities were real. Naked skin burns, it itches, it tears, it invites infection. And for a body now roaming dry savannahs, pursuing prey for hours under a relentless sun, these were no small challenges. But evolution is rarely single-purposed. One trait opens the door to another, and with the loss of fur came a compensatory gift, the expansion of eccrine sweat glands. These tiny tubular structures, now found in dizzying abundance across the human body, became the silent heroes of endurance. Sweat is not glamorous. It doesn't sparkle like a claw or glisten like a fang, but it is extraordinary. It allows us to dump heat with an efficiency unmatched in the animal kingdom. While a panting dog must pause to cool, and a wool-coated antelope risks collapse in a chase, a hairless human can continue, hour after hour, mile after mile. The body becomes a radiator, a moving engine cooled by evaporation. Fur impedes this process. It traps the sweat against the skin, slows evaporation, and reduces the cooling effect. For a predator that hunts in bursts, this is acceptable. But for one that hunts in time, that trades speed for stamina, it is disastrous. And so, over hundreds of thousands of years, the coat that once protected began to hinder. Shedding it wasn't simply loss, it was liberation. Even so, it wasn't total. Some patches remained, not randomly, but purposefully, in places where hair could still serve a function. The scalp retained its covering, shielding the brain from solar radiation. The eyebrows channeled sweat away from the eyes. The pubic and axillary regions, hubs of pheromonal communication, preserved coarser hair that may have played roles in sexual signaling or microbial defense. What disappeared then was not all hair, but its dominance. The forest receded, and in its place emerged a more expressive reactive skin. This skin, this vast canvas, began to hold the memory of sunlight and the residue of sweat. It became the surface upon which evolution would paint its next adaptations, and through its nakedness it began to speak. Not in words, but in heat, in flush, in contact, in colour. Colour, perhaps more than any other trait, reveals how the skin did not merely replace fur, it evolved into something entirely new. Once exposed, the skin needed to adapt to its new role, the body's outermost layer of defense and communication. One of the most critical adaptations to this exposure was the development of melanin, a pigment that protects against ultraviolet radiation. It's easy to forget just how radical a shift this was, to be no longer shaded by a dense coat of hair, but to stand bare under equatorial sun, day after day, generation after generation. Melanin is more than just coloration, it is chemistry. It absorbs harmful UV rays, dispersing the energy as harmless heat. In doing so, it protects the skin's DNA from mutations that could lead to cancer and shields folate, a crucial nutrient for fetal development, from being broken down by sunlight. These are not minor details, they are matters of life and death, reproduction and lineage. And so, as Homo erectus and its descendants moved ever further into the open, their skin darkened, not as decoration, but as armour. Here, again, is the paradox. In losing one layer of protection, the body developed another, one made not of fibre, but of function. This new layer responded not to seasons like a winter coat, but to climate and geography. Populations in high UV environments developed higher concentrations of eumelanin, giving rise to deeply pigmented skin that could withstand the intense African sun. It was a precise, elegant solution to the problem the vanishing coat had created. But this solution was not only protective, it was also expressive. Bare skin allowed emotional states to be signalled with immediacy, anger in a flush, fear in pallor, illness in a sudden change of tone. The body became legible, and that legibility mattered, especially in the growing complexity of social interaction. Naked skin could signal intention, pain, arousal, trust, all before a single sound was uttered. Where fur muted the language of the body, bare skin amplified it. This amplification reshaped sociality. It enabled new forms of coordination, cooperation and intimacy. Group hunting, infant care, sexual selection. All became more responsive in a species whose members could read each other not just by scent or posture, but by the shifting canvas of skin. And that skin, in turn, continued to evolve, not just in colour, but in sensitivity. Rich networks of nerve endings spread through the dermis, making touch a language of its own. Thus, from a simple loss, the shedding of hair, emerged a cascade of gains: thermal control, visual signalling, emotional transparency, and adaptive pigmentation. The coat that once defined our ancestors became obsolete, and in its place emerged the most versatile, responsive organ in the human body. But the story of the vanishing coat is not just about what we became, it is also about what we left behind, and what traces of that past still linger in the folds of our skin, in the silent echoes of our genes, in the rhythms of parasites and the memories of bones. Bones, after all, are what remain when the soft tissues have turned to dust. And while they do not preserve hair or skin, they tell us indirectly about the bodies that once walked the world, bodies that were reshaping themselves to survive in light, heat, and time. When paleoanthropologists uncover the skeletons of early Homo species, they read a story not just of locomotion and diet, but of thermodynamics, social structures, and surface area. The longer limbs of Homo erectus, the narrower pelvis, the increased body mass relative to surface exposure, all hint at a creature designed for heat dissipation, for movement, for life under the sun. This interpretation is reinforced by environmental context. The layers of sediment surrounding these fossils tell us of ancient savannahs, of recurring droughts, of shifting ecologies. Forests were retreating, leaving behind a patchwork of open grasslands and brush. In these spaces, a fur-covered primate would struggle, but a bipedal hunter, shedding heat with every step, scanning the horizon not for shade but for movement. This was an animal tailored to the age, and so we return to the central enigma. Not just when did we lose our hair, but why? The evidence from molecular clocks suggests a slow process, beginning over 2 million years ago and continuing well into the last few 100,000. The divergence of lice confirms the patchwork nature of that loss. The adaptation of sweat glands, melanin and upright posture tell us it was a trade-off, not of modesty, but of function. Even so, there is mystery. We still do not fully understand how quickly hairlessness emerged, nor do we know how it varied across populations, climates or lineages. Perhaps some ancestors remained furrier longer, clinging to shaded environments or colder highlands. Perhaps the shedding was uneven, accelerating in some climates, stalling in others. What we do know is that, by the time Homo sapiens emerged in Africa around 300,000 years ago, the transformation was largely complete. The naked ape had arrived, but naked is a strange word. It implies vulnerability, yes, but also honesty, exposure, presence. When our ancestors lost their fur, they gained a new relationship with the world. They touched more directly, felt more immediately. They became creatures who responded to heat not with retreat, but with ingenuity, with sweat, with shelter, with shade. With minds that built clothing not to replace what was lost, but to refine what was gained. And here is the quiet truth behind the vanishing coat, that evolution does not always favour protection. Sometimes it favours exposure. Sometimes survival means stepping into the elements rather than away from them. The human story is not one of shielding, but of adaptation through contact, through risk, through the shedding of the old, not as loss, but as transformation. And somewhere along that path, under an open sky, our ancestors stood, not cloaked in fur, but in the beginnings of something far more powerful, awareness. The coat was gone. No longer did the body wear a veil of hair, no longer did it move through the world clad in the silent softness that had shielded generations before. What remained was something rawer, something more vulnerable and more powerful. It was not fur that met the world now, but skin, bare, open, exposed to sky and wind and flame. And in that exposure a question emerged, ancient and burning. What happens when the body must defend itself with no covering at all? The answer did not come in the form of armour or claw, but in a shadow deeper than shadow, a darkening, a pigment, a whisper of sun turned inward. In this new world, where bodies moved across blazing plains, where shelter was not always near and trees stood further apart, something had to change, not around the human, but within it. And so the skin darkened, not with shame, not with fear, but with the quiet resolve of survival written in colour. This new kind of skin was not born in a day. It came slowly, like the fading of rainforests, like the lengthening of limbs, like the widening of vision. It was the response of a body learning the lessons of fire and sky, the lessons of drought, the lessons of endless walking. It was a skin that understood light, not just as something to bask in, but something to survive. And so it began to thicken, not in texture, but in meaning. The surface of the body became more than a barrier. It became a canvas, and on that canvas the sun left its mark. But the mark was not scarring. It was not pain. It was protection. Silent and invisible to the eye at first, then unmistakable, like nightfall in the afternoon. In some bodies the sun's gaze lingered, pressed harder, asked more. In return the skin responded, not with retreat, but with darkening. A slow, deliberate burn that wasn't fire, but memory. What is darkness, after all, if not a record of light? The skin learned to hold light without breaking, to carry heat without unravelling. It became a shield woven not from thread, but from years, from generations, from the long, unspoken history of exposure. And in that shield something else emerged. Variation. For not all bodies met the sun in the same way. Some lived in its full wrath, others in clouded shadow, among cooler winds and slanting dawns. The skin remembered, and it adjusted. This was no act of vanity, no aesthetic flourish. This was the land writing its story on the body listening, the body responding. In every place the skin turned deeper, there was a reason. In every place it faded, there was history. And between these shades lay the unspoken truth. That colour, long before it was politicized or moralized or misunderstood, was first and foremost a song of survival, sung quietly through the blood. What must it have felt like to become this canvas? To walk the world with the sky etched into your very surface. To wake each day and feel not just the warmth of the sun, but its weight, not metaphorical but real. To know that too much of it could wither the body, parch the spirit, that just enough could nourish, and that somehow in the space between danger and nourishment the skin stood as a wise, unspoken mediator. There was no language then for these things, no words to name pigment, no theories to explain cause and effect. There was only the body's slow memory, passed from mother to child, not in story but in skin. This was not knowledge carried in thought, it was knowledge carved in time. A kind of ancestral agreement forged beneath the skies of what would later be called Africa. The body said, "I will walk farther, so long as I am not burned." The skin replied, "I will darken, so that you may move." And thus a pact was made, sealed not with ink but with shadow. The new kind of skin did not simply protect, it enabled. Enabled what? Movement, exploration, endurance. The great distances early humans crossed were not measured only in steps, but in exposure, to heat, to wind, to raw and merciless light. The sun, so constant in its course, was both ally and adversary. Too much, and the body faltered. But with skin that could bear its gaze, humans were free to roam further, to linger in the open, to hunt at noon. It was not merely adaptation, it was liberation. And over time, something else began to happen. The skin, now both barrier and beacon, it became a point of recognition, not just to the sun, but to others. In the deep past, before language stretched its fingers across the plains, before words could name kin or clan or stranger, skin did the talking. It was how one could see who had come from the same valleys, the same riverbeds, the same scorched dust. It held the hue of memory, the trace of place. Somewhere, among these early beings, it may have even become beautiful, not by modern standards, not by artificial measure, but beautiful in the way that survival is beautiful, in the way that function, honed over millennia, carries an elegance beyond design. A skin that bore the sun's burden and did not break. That was strength. That was poetry. And when the rains returned, when dusk crept in and cooled the stone, that skin would still hold the day's warmth, like a story waiting to be told. It glistened, not with ornament, but with purpose. It had done its work quietly, held back what would harm, let in what would nourish, and all the while it had changed, just enough to meet the needs of each generation's son. This was not the skin of a beast. It was the skin of a becoming, and with it came something rare in the world of mammals. Visibility turned into meaning. Other creatures too had skin beneath their coats, but it was hidden, veiled, locked away behind layers of fur or feathers, protected but muted. Humans were different now. With the shedding of that ancient coat came not only new exposure to the world, but new exposure to each other. No longer was skin simply a shell. It was a canvas of emotion, a field of signs. The flush of blood beneath the surface could betray excitement or fear. A tremble in texture could speak of cold or anticipation. The sheen of sweat could tell of exertion, of nearness to the edge. In this way, the skin became the first language. It spoke not in syllables, but in shifts, in colour, in heat, in scent. A new form of intimacy was born, one that required no sound. The tribe could read each other with eyes alone. Still, this intimacy had its roots in survival. In places where the sun never relented, where shade was a treasure and the days long and merciless, skin had to know how to hold firm. And so the people born of those places carried deeper shades, richer with the sun's memory. This was not decoration, it was necessity. The darker the skin, the longer one could work, hunt, move beneath the open sky without collapse. The sun did not play favourites, but it did demand respect. And the body, in turn, learned to respect it back. There is no single moment we can point to. No sunrise when humans awoke with a new shade. No day when skin collectively darkened. It happened in layers, in generations, in migrations and returns. The earth turned, The people moved, the climate changed, and with it, the body listened and changed in kind. What the eyes could not always see, the skin remembered. It adapted to the new paths the feet wandered, to the elevation of mountains, to the mist of rivers, to the thirst of deserts. And in all this, the skin remained silent. It did not boast of its function. It did not cry out when it changed. It simply did what it needed to do, absorbing what must be taken in, shielding what must be kept safe. It was not fixed. It shifted, like the winds. It listened, like the trees. It endured, like the bones. And it did so in service of something larger, the ongoing project of being human. So we see, in the warmth of this ancient surface, not just a defence, but a kind of invitation. An invitation to continue, to cross the valley, to chase the sun across the tall grasses and into the night. For skin, in all its simplicity, became the reason the journey could continue. It was not just what we wore, it was who we were becoming. For with every step into new lands, the skin spoke its own language, shaped by the sky above and the earth below. It whispered of a latitude and altitude, of forests traded for grasslands, of shade abandoned for openness. This new kind of skin did not follow borders, for none existed yet. It followed the sun. It followed survival. It followed the subtle calculations of a body learning how much exposure it could endure before it began to unravel. Somewhere deep in the lineage of the hairless ape, a transformation more profound than the shedding of fur was taking place. The surface was no longer passive. It was alive with interaction, with purpose. The darkness that bloomed across it was not silence but intelligence, not thought in the way the brain thinks, but thought in the way nature reasons, slowly, thoroughly, and with consequence. Dark skin became a map, not just of geography, but of time. It marked the regions where sun reigned longest, where people had learned to live not under its threat but within its embrace. And as skin darkened, it didn't isolate, it connected. Among those with the deepest hues, there was a shared inheritance, not of appearance alone, but of resilience, of endurance, of a story written in pigment and passed down not through language but through presence. This story was not one of conquest. It was one of negotiation. The body, once armoured in hair, now negotiated directly with the elements. Skin was the medium, sunlight the scribe. And what emerged on that parchment was a testament to cooperation, between organism and environment, between necessity and form. We often imagine evolution as a struggle, as a battle. But here, in the story of melanin and exposure, we see something gentler, a mutual shaping, a quiet dance. And still, even in this adaptation, there were trade-offs. The same richness of skin that protected against sun could limit how the body responded to different climates. When some groups moved northward into lands of low light and long winters, the very gift that once protected them had to shift again. The story didn't stop. It bent, adjusted, folded over itself. The skin, like the mind, remained responsive, but those later changes, those lighter hues in northern tales, belong to chapters ahead. For now we remain under the searing light of the equatorial sun, among the early walkers whose bodies held the warmth of ancient afternoons. They knew no names for what their skin had become. They simply knew that it worked, that it endured, that it let them stay out longer, go farther, carry more, rest less. And in this endurance, a kind of identity was forming, not ethnic, not national, but elemental. To be human was now, in part, to be naked and shielded at once, not by something worn, but by something grown, something earned, the skin had learned to protect. Now, it would begin to express. This new surface of the body, unhidden, unarmoured, became a quiet stage for signals, a language of heat and hue, of glisten and touch. With the fur gone, there was no veil between the self and the world, and in that exposure communication emerged subtle and constant. The skin flushed in fear, blushed in attraction, tightened in cold, glowed with effort. In every slight shift of colour or moisture, another could read the state within. And long before speech was shaped in the throat, Understanding flowed across this canvas in waves. It was no longer only about endurance. It was about relationship. The bare skin drew people closer, taught them to notice the small things, a shift in tone, a mark of illness, a glow of health. Parents read their children's skin as carefully as any sound. Lovers touched and listened with their fingertips. Leaders stood before their groups with sweatless calm or radiant energy, their strength not in fur or fangs, but in presence, in vitality shown on the skin. In some ways, this vulnerability was more powerful than armour. Where fur insulated and concealed, skin revealed and invited. And in doing so, it encouraged trust. It made the body a part of the social world, a shared and visible vessel. One could see another's pain. One could see another's joy. This, too, was a form of protection, not from nature but from isolation. To be seen was to be held, to be part of something more than survival. And still, the skin remembered the sun. Even as it became a field for emotion and meaning, it did not forget its original pact. When the skies turned brutal and the air burned, the skin stood guard. It did not flinch, it darkened, it thickened, it shone. And when clouds gathered and seasons cooled, it listened again, changed again. This capacity, to respond, to adapt, to carry both history and current need, is what made human skin so unlike that of any other animal. It was not just barrier, it was biography, and that biography was not written in words but in layers, in the fine balance between heat and cold, burn and shadow, touch and distance. Every inch of the human body became part of this story, from the soles of the feet hardened by terrain to the backs of the hands browned by light. In this story, there was no need for climax. The skin was not striving toward perfection. It was simply participating, adjusting, evolving. The old coat, long since lost, was not mourned. It had served its time. What replaced it was not a compromise. It was an ascension, a new interface between the body and the world, a place where history met sunlight and where the body itself became both shield and signal, a new kind of skin, a new kind of human, a new way to live in the open and to carry the sky upon our backs. What does it mean to be seen? To truly be seen, not through fur or feathers, not through camouflage or armour, but through the bare, shifting mirror of one's own skin. To walk in a world where nothing hides you, where the winds brush directly against your body, where others glimpse your warmth, your health, your fear. When Homo erectus shed the ancient coat of hair, it was not just a change in insulation or temperature, it was a shift in visibility. For the first time in the story of mammals, the body itself became a language. No longer veiled in a uniform covering, the human frame began to speak in tones of colour, in beads of sweat, in pulses of blush and blanch. In that openness, a new kind of perception was required, and a new kind of intelligence. What must it have been like for one of our ancestors to see another approach across the open grassland and to read their intentions not from their distance, but from their skin? What changes when a body tells the truth before the mouth does? What is revealed when fear rises not in sound but in pallor, when attraction burns not in words but in the sudden flush of the cheeks? The body became a canvas, not of artifice, but of involuntary expression. Blood rose to the surface when the heart quickened. Vessels shrank when cold threatened. The skin became a broadcast tower for the silent language of emotion, and others learned to listen. And slowly, across generations, those who listened better survived better. Those who could read meaning in a lover's glow, a child's fever, a rival's tremor, they lived longer. They chose mates with keener eyes and kinder touches. They passed on not just genes, but an ever-deepening capacity to read the mirror of others. And so, this vulnerability became power. No longer were humans defined by claws or canines. They were defined by their openness. The bare skin that had once been a liability in a world of teeth and talons became a social advantage, a tool for trust. The exposed body made lies harder, made connection easier. The more visible one became, the more intertwined one became with the gaze of others. A blush could betray guilt. A pale face could warn of illness. And through such signals, groups could begin to care, to tend, to anticipate. What happens when survival favours sensitivity, when thriving depends not just on strength or strategy, but on the capacity to feel and to be felt in return? Among many animals, competition drives display, but for early humans, something deeper stirred. With the shedding of fur came the rise of skin as an invitation. The smooth curve of a shoulder, the rhythm of breath along a rib cage, the shimmer of sweat along the spine. These became signs, not just of survival, but of vitality, of potential, of allure. In this strange new world, sexual selection took on new dimensions. Beauty was no longer confined to feathers or dances. It was written in the very texture of the skin, in its scent, its glow, its ability to reflect light and hold warmth. The body became a call and a response, and desire learned to follow the patterns of skin. But beauty, like fear, was now exposed. There was no hiding a wound, no masking infection. The naked skin was both invitation and confession. To touch another was not just to feel, but to know, and that knowing became sacred. In the absence of fur, the body demanded intimacy. There was no more guessing from behind a pelt. To love was to risk, to show, to stand exposed, and so the skin shaped the mind. It did so not through force, but through reflection. The moment one body revealed itself to another, a dialogue began, silent, primal, inescapable. And that dialogue, repeated again and again across countless lifetimes, demanded new abilities. The eyes became sharper, not to see prey in the distance, but to catch the subtle flicker of change in a friend's expression. The hands became gentler, not just for tool-making, but for soothing, for embracing, for exploring a partner's warmth. The brain expanded its circuits, not simply to solve problems, but to interpret signals that came not in speech, but in skin. In this way, the evolution of our outermost layer fed the growth of our inner worlds. Emotions that had once lived in the body, the quickening heart, the trembling limbs, became visible and thus shareable. And when emotions could be shared, they could be understood. From this, a new kind of intelligence was born. Not the cold logic of calculation, but the fluid awareness of others, empathy, recognition, anticipation. This was not the intelligence of dominance, but of coexistence. Imagine a group of early humans gathered around a fire, their faces aglow, their limbs bare, their emotions laid open by the light. A child whimpers, and the mother senses something before a word is spoken. An elder shifts uncomfortably, and others move closer to offer warmth. These were not decisions made from thought alone. They were reactions shaped by a new kind of seeing, and they formed the roots of something we take for granted today, human community. But it came at a cost. To be exposed is to be vulnerable, and to be seen clearly is to carry the weight of being known, not just in strength, but in weakness. In our ancestors' nakedness, there was no place to hide a wound, no cloak for shame. Every blemish, every tremor, every loss of colour was part of the record. And still, this visibility endured, because something powerful had taken root, the desire to care and to be cared for. It is a quiet truth of our biology that our skin asks us to pay attention. It asks us to look closely, not just at others, but at ourselves. In its changes we read the story of the body. In its marks we read the story of the life. This attentiveness became more than instinct. It became a ritual, a responsibility, and eventually a form of beauty. So the skin, having shed its role as shield, took on new meaning as mirror. In its surface, the first reflections of human social intelligence began to flicker to life, and from those flickers came something greater than survival, the earliest glimmers of understanding. Understanding was not simply a matter of thought, it was a matter of feeling, of standing before another, watching their colour rise or fade, sensing their joy or sorrow not through words but through breath and blood. As the skin spoke more clearly, the body itself became part of the mind's vocabulary. In time, gestures emerged, not grand but subtle. A raised brow, a sidelong glance, the turn of a shoulder, the closing of hands. These were the first conversations of the body, born not from language but from openness. To see was to know was to act. And over generations, those who acted with care, who responded to what they saw in the skin of others, formed bonds that endured beyond the moment. It is easy to imagine the early gatherings beneath trees, around embers or under starlight, where one's body was no longer just their own but a part of a larger weave of awareness. The community was not simply made of people, it was made of gazes, of shared breath, of mirrored skin. Each body taught others how to feel, and each person became a lesson in how to be human. In this mirrored world, new forms of choice emerged. Mates were no longer selected only for strength or stature. Now, attraction followed the clues of skin, its evenness, its clarity, the stories it carried. To be seen was not just to be chosen, it was to be trusted, and to be trusted was to be safe. Slowly, the human body became a map of intentions, to approach without fear, to show warmth not just in voice but in flush and glow. This rewrote the script of intimacy. It brought forth a different kind of bond, one where vulnerability was not a danger but a gift. The nakedness of early humans, so often seen as loss, had instead become a language of belonging. It demanded honesty, and it offered connection. It made social intelligence not just useful but essential. And so, even as tools advanced and shelters improved and fire was tamed, it was the unspoken things, the flicker of colour in the cheek, the stillness of hands, the sweat that glistened on a forehead, that truly shaped our species. This was not strategy. It was instinct, honed through time, shaped by bodies that refused to hide. Through skin, emotion left its mark on the world. And in witnessing that mark, early humans came to understand something profound, that to care for another, you had to first notice them, that the act of seeing, truly seeing, was not passive. It was a choice, a reaching out, a quiet, shared recognition that we are not alone. It is this choice, repeated over eons, that would become the foundation of everything human. To choose to see and to be seen was no longer a momentary exchange, but the architecture of a new kind of world, a world where survival was woven into relationship, where strength was not in hiding, but in revealing, where the naked body, once so vulnerable, became the very medium through which empathy, trust and care could flow. With every generation, the human animal learned more about what it meant to live in the presence of others, and that presence began to shape not just behaviour, but identity. Imagine the child born into this world of watching. From its first cries, it is met not only with sound, but with sight, the gaze of kin, the touch of a hand, the soft warmth of another's skin against its own. It learns instinctively that its needs can be seen, that its discomfort can be read, that its joys matter because they echo across faces. In this, the skin becomes the first teacher, and its lessons linger for a lifetime. As that child grows, it learns to send its own signals, not deliberate ones, but subtle. A wince, a smile, a sudden stillness. It comes to understand that others respond not just to what is said, but to what is shown. And in this quiet dance, skin becomes story. The body, once silent, now speaks, and those who listen closely learn to anticipate the needs of others before they're spoken. They learn compassion. This capacity, to read and to be read, did not remain within the intimate bounds of family. It extended outward, across small groups, across unfamiliar encounters. A stranger's skin could reveal hunger, fatigue, fear, and that knowledge could change an outcome. A confrontation might dissolve. An offering might be made, and gradually the human world became one of response, not just reaction. A world in which empathy moved faster than violence. Of course, this did not make early humans perfect. There was still conflict, still fear, still moments where exposure was dangerous, where being seen invited harm. But even those moments reinforced the central truth, that skin carried meaning, that it could not be ignored. And in learning to live with that, and in learning to read its signals, to honour its openness, our ancestors developed the social skills that still underpin us today. For in this dance of glances and gestures, a deeper intelligence was growing, one not bound by language or logic, but by presence, by the ability to dwell with another's reality, even for a moment, to feel what they feel, not by thinking, but by seeing. And it was through this kind of intelligence born from bare skin that human beings began to knit themselves into something larger, a shared life, a shared fate, a kind of closeness that had never existed before. This closeness was not forged by blood alone, or even by necessity, but by the quiet revelations carried through the skin, a flicker of grief in the eyes, the warm hue of safety in another's presence, the glisten of effort after a long hunt. The body became a record of what it endured and what it longed for. And as this language deepened, so too did the bonds it created. No other creature had ever been so deeply wired to perceive, to attune, to recognize the lives of others written on the surface of flesh. It was not only emotion that lived there. Health left its marks. So did fertility, strength, exhaustion. The body became a forecast, a whisper of what might come. To be able to see when someone was weakening or healing or ready to bring new life into the world, this gave early humans an advantage far beyond tools. It gave them foresight. And with foresight came planning, collaboration, generosity. The simple act of witnessing became the seedbed of community. And with it, something else emerged. Responsibility. To witness was no longer neutral. It called for response. When a child's skin grew too hot, others cooled it. When a face paled, hands steadied it. The signals of the body, once silent, now stirred action. And in doing so, the bare human form became not just visible, but central, a point around which others moved, a story that others helped shape. Over time, this reflex to read and respond began to define social life itself. Tribes weren't held together only by proximity or shared blood, but by this intricate network of sensory connection. And though no words had yet formed to describe it, the understanding was clear. To be human was to belong not just in form, but in feeling. To be known not only by what you did, but by how your body revealed you, in pulse, in tremor, in warmth. And slowly through this web of response, early humans began to build more than survival. They began to build meaning. The skin that once marked only exposure now marked participation. It gave others access not only to your needs, but to your joys, your hopes, your sorrows. It became the vessel through which the invisible became real, a bridge from one mind to another. In that openness, memory deepened, affection lingered, grief found shape. The body was no longer a barrier. It was a window, a soft living mirror where each person could glimpse some part of themselves reflected in another. And this mirror did not fade with the centuries. It grew clearer, sharper, more nuanced. In time, it would help birth language, ritual, even art. But long before any of that, long before symbols carved in bone or stories sung into flame, there was this, the unspoken truth carried in skin, the quiet invitation to see and to be seen. And in that exchange, something enduring was born, a humanity that began not in thought, but in presence. It is a quiet thing, the moment a riff begins. There is no thunder, no fanfare, only a subtle rearrangement of glances, of assumptions, of presence. And so it may have been, in some long-vanished clearing, when two forms of early human locked eyes, one cloaked in a familiar pelt of hair, the other startlingly bare, a shimmer of skin where once was fur, a mirror instead of a mask. What passed between them in that gaze? Curiosity, recognition, or something colder, a fracture, the naked ones? That is what they must have seemed like, walking anomalies under the open sun, stripped of the ancestral coat that had for so long hidden the pulse and colour of the body. To the furred they may have looked wrong, too exposed, too alien. To the naked, perhaps it was the others who seemed bound in shadows, veiled in the scent and silence of the old world. This was not merely a matter of texture. It was the beginning of a division deeper than skin, the slow, invisible drift of identity itself. Hairlessness was not just a trait, it was a statement. It spoke of endurance, of sweat and distance, of survival under the crushing sun rather than the cloistering canopy. It marked a shift not only in biology but in world view. Those who bore the new skin had learned to suffer differently. They had trained their bodies to spill water so they could hold fire. They were shaped by movement, not stillness, and in their very bodies they carried the scent of transformation. But what happens when transformation is visible? When change walks upright and unmistakable? When a cousin becomes an emblem of a path you did not take? Even in the gentlest of times, difference unsettles. In the harsh, indifferent plains where hunger nips and shadows stalk, difference can divide. Could the furred ones, seeing their naked kin, feel something ancestral quiver inside them? A loss, a threat, or a pull? The naked form was not just strange, it was expressive. It showed wounds that would have hidden beneath fur. It revealed illness, arousal, youth, age, and fear with every twitch and shimmer. It bore no disguises. Among the furred, this may have looked like vulnerability. Among the naked, it became intimacy. And there, perhaps, the first misunderstandings bloomed. What seemed shameless to one looked honest to another. What seemed proper to one looked distant to the other. The body became a dialect, and slowly, across generations, the dialects drifted. Some scholars now wonder, did this divergence in appearance contribute to deeper separations in community, in mate choice, in myth and memory? Could those early subtle judgments have echoed down through time, shaping not just mating habits, but the very fabric of kinship and identity? When do skin and story become the same thing? What happens when a body stops being just a body and starts being a border? A line drawn not with ink or stone, but with flesh. A boundary that walks and breathes and sweats beneath the sun. For Homo erectus, whose bodies had adapted to open skies and long distances, the boundary may not have been one they felt. But for others, kin with more hair, shaped by different pressures, holding to older shelters and older ways, the difference may have felt unmistakable, perhaps even irreversible. In those early days, identity was not written in language or flag. It was written in scent, in sound, in movement, in skin. And when two groups moved differently, carried themselves with different rhythms of silence and sweat, they began to belong not just to different bands, but to different worlds. The naked ones may have travelled farther, carried water in their bodies and fire in their hands. They may have looked strange not only in form but in practice, building different shelters, hunting in the heat, circling prey with patience rather than pounce. Their strategies shaped their societies, and in those strategies, a new kind of self took root. It's tempting to imagine a clean split, a moment of dramatic parting, a campfire confrontation, a rejection, a departure. But in truth, it would have been quieter, a fading of contact, a turning away, fewer children born between groups, a shift in gaze, from recognition to suspicion, from kin to other. Yet even as paths diverged, echoes remained. Genes flowed, if only for a while longer. Faces held familiar shapes, hands the same number of fingers. But the meanings carried by those bodies were shifting. The bare skin of Homo erectus was no longer just a trait. It was a statement of separation, a living signal that something new had begun and something old was being left behind. And with that separation came isolation, not of place, but of perception. To look upon the furred others was perhaps to look backward. To be seen by them was to carry the strange burden of becoming symbol, a walking reminder of another future. That burden may have deepened the rift. It may have shaped rituals, taboos, even early belief. Were the naked ones seen as blessed, cursed? Were they feared or followed? Did stories begin to gather around their bodies, stories that cast them as different not just in shape, but in soul? These are questions without answers, but not without weight. The fossil record tells us little about feeling, but it tells us enough to imagine, enough to know that human difference is old, and that our bodies, even then, were not just biology, but biography. The naked skin told a story, and that story over time became hard to translate, hard to ignore, hard to forget. Because what is remembered through contrast. The naked ones, strange in their exposure, radiant and raw, would have stood out even in the low light of dusk, even through the mist of memory. And over generations that image would solidify, not just in the eye, but in the story, are people who shed their coat, who let the world see them, who ran with the heat instead of fleeing it. And in that visibility, they became legend, for better or worse. Perhaps the furred groups told tales about them, whispered warnings around the fire, or simply looked away when their figures passed on the horizon. Perhaps they watched with fascination or fear, wondering what it meant to survive without the pelt of protection. And perhaps they thought the naked ones had become something else entirely, not just different in skin, but in essence. Among the naked themselves, the awareness of difference may have deepened in subtler ways, not through pride or superiority, but through the strange loneliness of being new. To be unlike your kin is to be seen, and not seen all at once. They may have looked at their own reflection in still water, and wondered what they had become, what it meant to wear the sun directly, to feel the breeze not as muffled texture but as intimate presence. Their skin was not a costume, it could not be removed. It was a permanent invitation to the world's gaze and a permanent break from those who had stayed behind. And yet, inside that skin, the same questions beat. Where do I belong? Who are my people? The answers to those questions over time formed new circles. The naked ones became a tribe unto themselves, not defined by territory, but by shared exposure, a brotherhood of the bear. And slowly they turned toward each other for recognition, because the old mirrors no longer reflected them back. In each other's eyes they saw not just likeness, but understanding, a recognition of the body's honesty, a shared resilience, a common heat. And that is where cohesion begins, not just in similarity, but in shared solitude. The naked skin, once merely a vessel for sweat and light, had become a marker. It meant you belonged, not everywhere, but somewhere. It meant you were part of a people who had stepped into a new kind of relationship with the world and with each other. The skin was no longer just exposed, it was expressive. And with that, new forms of empathy were born, not abstract but tactile. To touch another was to affirm them, to see their skin react, flush, tighten, glow, was to know what they felt, even without speech. This was not just a change in how humans looked, it was a change in how they knew each other, and how they knew who they were. Identity does not arrive all at once. It settles slowly, the way dust settles after a distant herd has passed, drifting, accumulating, shaping the ground until the old landscape is no longer quite the same. For the naked ones, this slow settling took the form of rituals that were not yet rituals, habits that were not yet culture, a way of moving together beneath the open sky, of reading each other's bodies with a sensitivity the furred might never fully understand. Because the bare skin was a constant conversation. It revealed mood before sound, exhaustion before collapse, longing before touch. In time, the naked ones may have learned to lean into this visibility, to weave it into their lives. They could sense when a companion faltered during a long trek. They noticed when a child's warmth shifted, signalling need. They recognized desire, fear, uncertainty, not through analysis, but through instinct. Their bodies became lanterns, each casting its own soft glow, each illuminating the others. Among the furred, such signals would have been muted, hidden beneath layers of hair, muffled behind inherited protection. Their communication had its own rhythms, its own depth, but it was different, shaded, enclosed, less porous to sight. And so, as the naked ones grew more attuned to the exposed body, their world began to tilt away from their cousins. What mattered most to them, what anchored their survival, was something the furred could not fully perceive. This was not superiority. It was divergence. Two paths unfolding side by side, shaped by the smallest of differences that grew heavier with every generation. A tilt in posture, a shift in trust, a comfort with being seen. While the furred might have guarded their vulnerabilities behind the quiet shield of hair, the naked ones embraced theirs, learned from them, even found strength in revealing them. The divide widened not through conflict, but through comfort, each group at ease in a world the other found difficult. And with comfort came meaning. The naked ones began to craft a sense of belonging around the simple fact of being exposed. around the sun-warmed surface of their skin, around the shared trials of wind, cold and heat. Their difference was not just biological, it was experiential, and experience has a way of carving deep canyons into the mind. Older bonds faded, new bonds formed. What had once been a single great tapestry of hominin life began to fray along the seam of appearance and adaptation. The split between worlds was not violent, but it was profound. It shaped who they spent time with, who they trusted, who they chose as partners. The furred became distant silhouettes, familiar yet foreign. The naked ones became something new, a people whose identity was carved not from tools or symbols, but from the simple act of being seen. In this way, a new kind of tribe slowly took shape, one bound not by blood alone, but by the truth carried in uncovered skin, a truth that could not be hidden, even if one wished it could. In the open plains under the high sun, the naked ones walked their own path. But paths do not always diverge quietly. Some meetings between the furred and the bare may have ended in curiosity, others in avoidance, and still others in confrontation, not just of bodies, but of worldviews. Imagine the moment when a furred hominin, covered and cautious, meets the gaze of a skin-bare cousin whose body betrays every flicker of emotion, one cloaked in anonymity, the other in revelation. There may have been no common language strong enough to bridge the distance, but evolution is not a single event. It is a long unfolding, shaped as much by chance as by necessity. And sometimes, the worlds may have overlapped, in shared waterholes, in seasonal migrations, in common dangers. In these overlaps, tension may have mixed with fascination. The naked ones, perhaps, were feared for their strangeness, but also watched for their resilience, and the furred, though separate, still carried the echoes of kinship. Not all rifts become chasms. Some remain as low valleys, crossed from time to time by those who dare. Still, the trend was clear. Across generations, the naked ones became more than a curiosity. They became a story other groups told, a myth etched into memory. Maybe they were called ghosts, spirits, sun children, desert walkers. Maybe they were envied for their heat or pitied for their exposure, but they were remembered. And that memory, shaped by distance and repetition, began to write a new kind of border, not of terrain, but of identity. Within the naked ones themselves, the experience of being different became the foundation of community. Their children grew up knowing no other skin but the one the wind touched. Their elders remembered what it meant to be mistaken for prey, only to become the most persistent hunter. Their rituals formed not just around food or fire, but around the rhythms of the body, the sheen of sweat, the texture of touch, the stories etched in scars and sun-darkened skin. As seasons passed, their bond deepened. They were no longer just those without fur. They were something more cohesive, more intentional. A lineage not just of bones, but of trust in what could be seen, and what seeing could mean. They adapted not only to survive the world, but to understand and be understood within it. Their nakedness, once a mark of vulnerability, became a marker of a new kind of strength. The split between worlds, then, was not simply a matter of appearance. It was a shift in how identity was shaped. It was the beginning of a long, slow arc toward the human we recognize now, not only in flesh, but in mind and story. Because from the moment one group stood bare before the world, something irreversible had begun. They had become more than a body. They had become a reflection, not just of light, but of each other. There was a time when the wind spoke directly to our skin, when the sun etched its arc into the very surface of our backs, and the night laid itself like ice upon our bare shoulders. We had stepped away from the shelter of fur, cast off the ancestral cloak, and walked into the world as the naked ones. But in doing so, we did not remain exposed forever. Something changed. Not in the body, but in the hands. Not in the blood, but in the mind. For the same brain that once deciphered the movements of prey and the shifting moods of the sky began to see another kind of pattern. The rhythm of need, the shape of absence, the ache of the uncovered. From that ache the first thread was pulled, and with that thread the second skin was born. What must it have been like to feel the first woven thing against the flesh? Was it comfort or confusion? Was it a return to something lost, a mimicry of the warmth once granted by hair? Or was it something entirely new, something that extended the human body into a tool, a mask, a message? In that moment, when a strip of hide was wrapped around a thigh, or a piece of bark fibre was knotted over a shoulder, the body changed. No longer merely a biological form, it became an idea, a canvas dressed by intent. And as the idea spread, so too did the meaning of nakedness shift. To be unclothed was no longer simply to be human. It became a state, a choice, a vulnerability one could control. But why cover what evolution had uncovered? Why, after shedding fur to survive, did we begin to drape ourselves again in fragments of the world? The answer lies not in contradiction, but in complexity. Hairlessness gave us a new relationship to heat, to effort, to distance, but it also left us raw before the elements. Rain did not slide off our backs, thorns did not part for our passage, fire did not always come fast enough. The skin, once silent beneath a coat, now screamed when burned, when scratched, when frozen. And so, protection returned, not through biology, but through invention. We did not regrow our hair, we made new forms of shelter, mobile and intimate, stitched not to the bones but to the body's outline. Clothing became our species' reply to its own invention, but there is more to covering than warmth. There is ritual, there is memory, there is meaning. A scrap of animal hide may shield a chest from wind, but it also holds the story of the hunt. A twist of grass around the wrist may keep sweat at bay, but it also marks a gesture, a belonging, a belief. In time, what we wore became more than what we needed. It became who we were, and the skin, once a solitary veil, found itself in dialogue with another surface, the second skin made not of flesh, but of intention. What happens when identity no longer ends at the boundary of the body? It begins to flow outward, across textures, through colours, into shapes that others can read. The second skin was never just about concealment, it was about declaration, about choosing how one would be seen when nature had once decided it for us. In a world where bare skin told the truth of the body, clothing introduced something new, ambiguity. A body could be shivering, but the pelt across its shoulders could make it look composed. A scar could lie beneath a drape of woven grass, invisible to a stranger's eye. With each covering, humanity began to experiment, not just with materials, but with the layers of self. The earliest wrappings were not symmetrical, they weren't polished or dyed, but even in their crude forms they carried whispers of choice. A tie here instead of there. A fold shaped not for utility, but for beauty. Perhaps a pattern etched into a scrap of leather. From necessity bloomed creativity, and from creativity the seeds of expression. Where once bodies spoke in blushing warmth or shivering fear, now garments added their own voice, quiet but potent. And slowly clothing became the skin's new dialect. As bands of early humans migrated into colder realms, this new skin became essential, not just to endure frost or snow, but to retain the warmth of meaning, to pass on technique, how to tan, how to stitch, how to soften hide and draw it into form. Knowledge was no longer just biological, it became cultural, generational. A mother wrapping her child in fur wasn't merely offering protection, she was offering memory, the knowledge of those who came before, the warmth of a fire long since extinguished, still lingering in the fibres of tradition. And just as clothes preserved memory, they began to shape ritual. The first initiations may not have been marked by speech, but by dress. A child becoming a hunter might receive a strip of red-dyed bark. A woman entering motherhood, a feathered braid. Coverings became symbols, and symbols became the roots of ceremony. In these moments, the second skin spoke of transformation, of roles, responsibilities, and reverence. And so, garments became portals, thresholds between oneself and the next, not only a boundary with the world, but with time. But even more subtle was how the second skin created difference, not between body and weather, but between one group and another. A twist of vine worn at the ankle might mean nothing in one clan, but everything in another. A particular knot, a certain pelt, these became badges of identity, markers of who belonged and who did not. Nakedness, once a universal condition, now became a rare and charged state. To be uncovered was to be vulnerable again, or rebellious, or sacred. The skin beneath the second skin became mysterious once more, hidden not by fur but by the first echoes of culture, and in that mystery humanity found power. Not the raw power of muscle or fire, but a softer, more enduring force, the power to choose how to be seen, the power to sculpt identity, not from flesh alone, but from what adorned it. With the second skin, we began to edit ourselves, to shape impressions before a word was spoken, to carry stories not in scars but in stitchings, not in posture but in pattern. Every wrapping became a negotiation between visibility and concealment, between heritage and adaptation. Over time, these coverings became more than protection or even expression. They became boundaries of memory, sacred lines drawn between the known and the unknown, the initiated and the outsider. In burial sites dating tens of thousands of years ago, we find traces of these choices: beads threaded into leather, ochre-stained tunics, tiny awls for sewing, lying beside the bones. These fragments speak not only of what people wore, but how deeply they cared to craft. They hint at a truth, that long before writing we were already fluent in the language of material. Clothing began to function as an archive, a tactile record of a people's seasons, migrations, alliances and dreams. A certain twist of sinew might recall a long journey south. A mantle of feathers might invoke a lost ancestor, reborn in ceremony. And so, the body became not just the bearer of life, but the bearer of history. To wear something was to carry meaning woven tightly against the skin. But as meaning deepened, so too did complexity. Now the act of removing the second skin became charged. In warmth, to disrobe was to rest. In ritual, it was to return to something primal. But in conflict, to be stripped was to be shamed, exposed, diminished. Vulnerability, once our default state, was now situational, conditional. We had surrounded our nakedness with intention, and thus transformed it into something rare and potent. Nudity became a language of defiance, of intimacy, of power reversed. This shift also changed how we touched one another. Where once skin met skin freely, in grooming, in warmth, in grief, now the fabric intervened. To reach beneath it became permission, a right. Affection moved from casual contact to deliberate gesture. The second skin created a layer of formality, of chosen thresholds, a boundary that could be crossed, but only with care. And through all of this, the body adapted again, not in bone or blood, but in awareness. We became creatures of interface. Where fur had once simply been there, part of the body's nature, clothing required constant negotiation. When to wear, what to wear. Who might see, who must not? Our days became shaped by these decisions, and in them we wove a new sense of self. From sinew and fibre, from hide and bark, we spun the earliest threads of culture, and in doing so, we dressed not just the body, but the mind. Because to wrap the body was to imagine the body, to imagine what it was and what it wasn't. With clothing came boundaries not only between skin and world, but between self and other. No longer was identity merely what the earth gave us, the hue of our skin, the shape of our faces, the cadence of our steps. Identity could now be braided, dyed, layered. To belong to a group could mean to dress as they did. To differ could mean to dress otherwise. Across tundra and savanna, mountains and coasts, garments became markers of belonging, whispers of ancestry, declarations of position. A sash might separate the child from the adult. A certain wrap might tell of mourning. Another might speak of readiness for union, or war, or return. Clothing became the earliest form of ceremony, the ritual of waking, of leaving shelter, of facing the world. Each morning the act of dressing became a quiet promise, to enter society, to be seen, to participate. And in the hush of evening, the removal of that second skin returned the body to solitude, to dream. This daily rhythm carved time into meaning. The naked body was no longer merely biology. It was a state of being, a space of potential, a pause between chapters. But this second skin did more than reflect culture. It began to shape it. It allowed humans to live in climates far beyond their tropical origins, to wander into ice and altitude. It allowed hunters to slip silently through thickets, cloaked in the scent and colour of their quarry. It allowed dancers to transform into spirits, cloaked in feathers and shells. It allowed elders to wrap stories around children, not just in words, but in what they wore. Clothing became a technology of survival, yes, but also of imagination. And with imagination came rules. When something becomes meaningful, it becomes contested. Over time, the question of what could be worn and by whom became a force unto itself. In some places, only certain cloths could touch certain skins. In others, only those who had completed certain tasks could wear specific marks. With this, clothing began to echo hierarchy, echo memory, echo power. The nakedness beneath was unchanged, still the same skin that sweat and shivered, that flushed with fear and warmed with touch. But the layers above now told a different story, one chosen, or imposed. This tension, between body and wrapping, between nature and culture, would ripple through the rest of human history. Even now, in the long arc that leads to us, we carry echoes of that shift. The weight of a jacket, the tug of a sleeve, the decision of what to wear before stepping outside. These are not modern concerns. They are ancient rituals, shaped in the long dusk of our early ancestors, when the wind whispered through open plains and the first humans wrapped themselves in meaning. And perhaps this is the quiet irony at the heart of our story, that we became naked through evolution, and then spent tens of thousands of years learning how to clothe that nakedness, not out of shame alone, but out of longing. Longing for shelter, for identity, for belonging. Our skin, once an open book written in sweat and emotion, became layered in symbols, and yet, even beneath the folds of woven bark, of sinew-stitched hide, of grass and fur and thread, we never truly left that ancestral exposure behind. Because to cover the body is also to call attention to it. The second skin did not erase the first, it enhanced it. The more we adorned, the more we emphasized. Every cloak was a canvas, every ornament a reflection, and as stories passed from mouth to ear, they also passed from hand to loom. Clothes became memory, garments made for birth, for burial, for becoming. And slowly, a truth settled in. The naked body was not just a fact, it was a moment to be lost, to be reclaimed, to be revealed. And there were still times, even in the ritual and rhythm of dressing, where the coverings fell away. At birth, at death, in the hush between lovers or the exhaustion of the hunt, the human form stood once more as it had in the beginning, bare, breathing, unchanged. And in those moments, perhaps, a different kind of knowing returned, a remembrance that the second skin was a choice, that beneath it lay the original language, warmth, pulse, openness. The earliest humans may not have spoken the words we use now, but they knew what it meant to cover, and they knew what it meant to be uncovered. They felt the difference between the wind on cloth and the wind on flesh. They understood how the act of wrapping could be protection, could be decoration, could be prayer. In some ways, clothing was our first bridge between body and world, not to hide, but to relate. Not to forget the skin, but to extend its meaning. And that is perhaps the final gift of the second skin. It reminds us subtly that we are creatures of both exposure and concealment, that our strength lies not in choosing one over the other, but in navigating the space between. We were born bare, we learn to wrap ourselves in fibre and meaning. But in every layer we've added, we have also carried the echo of that first unveiling, that moment when the sun met skin and the world saw us truly for the first time. Let the wind touch your arm. Let the fabric fall for a moment. Beneath it all, the story continues. The skin still listens. The body still speaks. And even now, in this far future we call the present, we are still learning how to wear our second skin. It begins again with the body. not as an answer, but as a question that persists, like a footprint in dust that refuses to be erased. Why are we hairless? Why did we shed the coat that once wrapped our ancestors in warmth and protection? The question has followed us through savanna winds and glacial shadows, through blood and fire and longing. And now, at the end of the path, the mirror turns once more. To look upon the naked human form is to glimpse both artifact and aftermath, a shape carved not by design, but by endurance, by sweat, by the fierce arithmetic of survival. This is a body that once ran under the punishing sun, chasing shadows until they collapsed. A body that traded fur for evaporation, warmth for distance, concealment for stamina. But is that all? Is this smooth and open flesh just the legacy of running through heat? No. Because the heat did not only sculpt muscles, it scorched intimacy into skin. Sweat did not only cool the flesh, it left trails of effort, of fear, of attraction. Every droplet became a signature, every gleam a word in a language only humans would learn to read. And if the body had stopped there, it might have remained merely functional, a clever trick in nature's endless game of advantage. But the naked body did not stop. It learned to speak. It learned to feel. It became something more. Parasites had crawled beneath the fur of ancestors for 1,000,000 years. They had whispered illness, carved misery, and hidden in the dark. With hair, they thrived. Without it, they fled. In shedding fur, we didn't only make ourselves visible, we declared war on those we could not see. A clean surface was not just a stage for emotion. It was a fortress against infestation. And in this shift, vulnerability became resistance. Yet again, is that enough? Was it simply defense that made the body bare? No, because something deeper stirred beneath the skin, something unmeasurable. Once the fur was gone, the eye stayed. It lingered. It watched. It began to judge, to long, to wonder. Skin became not just a barrier, but a beacon. Its tone changed with the sun. Its texture shifted with time. Its marks bore the stories of birth and labour and the age. Hairlessness opened a new world of selection, not by claw or cry, but by glance and gaze. Sexuality stepped onto this new terrain with ancient instincts and new desires. The body now offered information at a glance: fertility, health, readiness, power. The smooth curve of a back, the flex of a calf, the swell of a breast or hip. These became invitations, not only to mate, but to mean. The body, stripped of fur, became not only animal, but symbol. And what happens when symbol and skin become one? What happens when survival depends not on hiding, but on being read? Then the skin is no longer just skin. It is scripture, a parchment written in heat, in desire, in fear. And as the generations passed, the human body was no longer merely surviving its environment, but adapting to be seen within it. The nakedness that once exposed it to harm began to draw others near. Children sought warmth against it. Lovers pressed their hands upon it. Strangers judged, trusted, envied, desired, all through what they could see in the unguarded flesh of another. Even pain began to speak. A wound on the surface was not just a tear in the flesh. It was a call. Others could witness it. Others could care. Before there were words, there was watching, and in that watching, empathy took root. Perhaps it began with a child's fever, visible in the flush of cheeks, or a hunter's limp, evident in the taut skin across a thigh. Recognition brought response, and response brought bond. In time, that bond grew larger than any single tribe or camp. The skin that once divided began to unite, not perfectly, not always. But where once the furred and the naked may have marked each other as other, now the body could cross that line, not with claws or warning cries, but with touch, with gesture, with care. This was not just the body as tool, but the body as invitation. And still, the paradox endured. Nakedness made us more fragile. The sun punished us. The cold stalked us. Thorns tore at us. There was no easy return to the furred past. Instead, there was adaptation. We stitched the first garments not to decorate, but to shield. We painted our bodies not only in vanity, but in prayer. The skin, so vulnerable, now demanded care, demanded ritual, demanded memory. It had become not just the site of survival, but the canvas of culture. And through all this, the mind watched the body, and the body shaped the mind. As humans began to read the surface of each other, they began to read beneath it, to imagine what another might feel, to guess, to anticipate, to hurt with. The roots of compassion are buried not in words, but in the silent revelations of skin. So when we ask, why are we hairless? The answer resists certainty. Was it heat? Was it parasites? Was it touch? Was it longing? Yes, and no, and something else. Because the human body is not the product of one force, it is the meeting ground of many, the slow echo of footsteps in ash, the glimmer of sweat under a full moon, the hush of hands pressed against a newborn's chest. It is not the solution that defines us, it is the question made flesh. Because to be human is to carry ambiguity in the very architecture of our being. We are not neat answers carved by a single purpose, but the result of tensions between exposure and endurance, between attraction and danger, between individuality and belonging. The body is not a solved riddle, it is a living contradiction. And our skin, so easily wounded, so urgently protected, so carefully adorned, is where those contradictions meet. Consider the many forces that shaped us. The sun, relentless and absolute, driving the need for cooling. The open plains demanding distance and persistence. The insects that crawled, bit, and burrowed, pushing us toward a smoother surface. The eyes of others, always watching, always judging, always needing signs. There was no committee deciding which pressure mattered most. No conscious hand guided the changes. The human form, hairless, upright, sweating, touching, is what emerged from that swirl of necessity and chance. And then, somewhere along the way, we began to wonder about ourselves. We turned our gaze inward. The body, once only a vehicle for survival, became something to ponder, to reflect upon. Perhaps the first moment of philosophy was not a question shouted into the stars, but a silent glance into still water, a face, bare and unfamiliar, gazing back. The mirror of a pool, the mirror of another's eyes, the mirror of skin, these are where thought began. It is fitting, then, that our bodies carry mystery, that the reasons for our nakedness cannot be pinned to a single trait or event, because we are not merely the sum of our adaptations, we are also the interpreters of them. We walk in bodies shaped by pressures we no longer remember, yet we search them for meaning. We ask what it means to be hairless, even as we adorn our skin with symbols, wrap it in stories and judge it with fashion and fear. This is not a flaw of the body, this is its gift. For in that unresolved quality, in that openness, the human form remains a question we never finish asking. And in asking, we discover ourselves, not just as individuals, but as a species bound by wonder, bound by the act of noticing. The story of our skin, then, is not over. It continues each time we see and are seen, each time we feel the wind against our chest, each time we cover ourselves for warmth or expose ourselves in trust. The nakedness that began as adaptation has become a theatre of culture, of identity, of love. And the audience always is us. For every time we witness our own reflection, in water, in glass, in another's eyes, we return to that original question. Why are we hairless? And the answer stretches in layers, like the shifting patterns of heat and shadow across our bodies. It is not a single explanation. It is a network, a web, a map written in sweat and warmth, in exposure and intimacy, in survival and imagination. Each strand of that web connects to another. The cooling of the flesh, the avoidance of parasites, the subtle signals of desire, the bonds of trust, the meaning we wrap around ourselves in ritual and cloth. Hairlessness is both biology and culture, vulnerability and strength, canvas and brush. In returning to the question, we realize that the body has always been a paradox. It is both fragile and resilient, private and public, visible and concealed. Every pore, every fold, every pulse of heat or blood tells a story of adaptation, of what was endured, what was overcome, and what was discovered along the way. Hairlessness made us naked before the world, yes, but it also made us legible, to ourselves, to others, to the future. It made intimacy possible, understanding possible, empathy possible, and yet it left us exposed, still vulnerable, still human. This duality is our inheritance. Every flush of emotion, every bead of sweat, every shiver of fear or excitement carries the echo of the first naked ones who ran under the sun, who felt the wind directly against their skin, who learned to interpret each other without words. That legacy is stitched into our flesh. It is in the way we recognize warmth in another's touch, danger in a glance, attraction in a shimmer. Hairlessness is not only a trait of survival, it is a trait of perception, of connection, of being seen and seeing. And as we layer meaning upon meaning, we find that the question itself transforms. It is no longer merely why are we hairless? It becomes what can this body, this skin, this openness teach us? It becomes an exploration of relationships, with the sun, the wind, other humans, ourselves. It becomes a meditation on balance, between protection and exposure, instinct and intention, history and possibility. And in this reflection, we understand that hairlessness was not the end of a story, but the opening of one, a story we continue to write with every glance, every touch, every heartbeat. The mirror of the self, once obscured by hair, is now laid bare. And in that bareness lies not shame, not fragility, but a profound invitation. An invitation to feel, to connect, to question, to wonder, to recognize the body not merely as survival, but as meaning, as expression, as history written in living flesh. It is here, in this reflection, that the journey circles back upon itself, and the viewer, transformed by understanding, finally sees the depth of the question. Hairlessness is not solved. It is experienced. It is observed. It is lived. And so, we return to the body one last time, not for answers, but for understanding. The skin, once a simple boundary between self and world, is now revealed as both relic and canvas, a record of evolution, a stage for culture, a medium for emotion and connection. Every scar, every hue, every tremor in its surface carries the stories of survival, endurance, and adaptation. The hairless body is a testament to the intertwined forces that shaped it. Heat and sun, sweat and exertion, parasites and predators, touch and desire, trust and intimacy. Yet it remains unresolved, just as life itself is unresolved. There is no final explanation that can capture all its meaning, no single principle that can account for the layers of vulnerability and strength etched into our flesh. The body is not a puzzle to be solved, but a mirror to be studied, to be felt, to be reflected upon. And in that mirror, we see not only the legacy of the past, but the possibilities of our own humanity. We see how nakedness once challenged us, and how it continues to teach us about connection, perception, and empathy. This journey, through sweating, parasites, sexuality, sociality, and symbolism, comes full circle. The body stripped of hair was first a tool of survival, then a stage for communication, then a canvas for culture. Each adaptation layered upon the last, creating a human form that is complex, expressive, and profoundly social. The naked skin allowed for endurance, for intimacy, for recognition, for trust. It created the conditions for a new intelligence, one that could read, respond, and reflect not only on others, but on itself. And in doing so, it shaped not just what humans could do, but who they could become. And yet, for all the insight gained, the question remains open. Hairlessness is not a fact that can be reduced to heat or endurance or sexual selection alone. It is a constellation of factors, a living paradox, a reminder that evolution is messy, contingent, and beautiful in its ambiguity. The body, like the story it tells, is never complete. Every generation adds its own marks, its own responses, its own interpretations. Every human who stands beneath the sun, who feels the wind against their skin, who notices the warmth of another, participates in this ongoing narrative. So we return to the mirror and we see ourselves, not fully explained, not fully understood, but undeniably human, vulnerable and resilient, exposed and expressive, fragile and strong. The hairless body is not merely a biological curiosity. It is the intersection of forces that shaped our species, and it continues to shape the way we live, perceive, and relate. It is the ultimate paradox of being, at once a relic of survival, a canvas of culture, and a lens into the complexity of what it means to be human. And in that mirror, we are invited to continue asking, continue observing, and continue living, hairless, aware, and profoundly, impossibly alive. The mirror stands before you, not of glass, not of water, but of time. It reflects not a single face, but the unbroken chain of forms that led to you. The naked body that once stepped into the open, the first creature to wear its own vulnerability without apology. To be human is to live within that inheritance, to carry the weight and wonder of exposed skin. And now, as the journey closes, the question no longer whispers, why are we hairless? But what does it mean to live this way? For the absence of fur is not absence at all. It is presence, made visible. Our skin, bare and unguarded, turned the body into a boundary between the internal and the infinite, a surface that feels everything: heat, pain, affection, and the slow tremor of time itself. It is both barrier and bridge, fragile enough to bruise and yet resilient enough to remember touch. What creature could live so raw, so aware, and not be changed by it? To lose one's fur was to gain awareness of the world in new dimensions. The sun no longer filtered through a pelt but struck directly, marking the body with shadow and warmth. The wind no longer brushed the tips of hair but whispered across nerves alive with sensation. Every encounter with the environment became a conversation, the world speaking through temperature and texture, and the body answering in goosebumps and shivers, in heat and ache. What was once shielded was now felt. What was once automatic became conscious. But the story of our skin did not end with adaptation. It began to mirror our inner lives. When we flushed, when we paled, when we sweated or shivered, we revealed not only our physical state but our emotional one. The body became a window into the soul long before the word soul had meaning. To look upon another's skin was to see the truth of their being: hunger, fear, excitement, grief. The body spoke before language, and that speech remains with us still. We may wear clothes, may learn restraint, but beneath it all, our skin continues to confess. And so, the human condition can be read upon the body itself. Exposure and empathy are two sides of the same coin. We learn to care for one another because we could see each other, not only in health, but in harm. The nakedness of our ancestors became the foundation of our compassion. To live without fur was to live among others who could not help but notice when we bled, when we blushed, when we trembled. In that visibility, community began, and perhaps that is the most astonishing legacy of our bareness, that it demanded tenderness. The skin taught us not to hide, but to protect, not to dominate, but to connect. To be naked was to be human, and to be human was to feel. What happens when awareness itself becomes our final adaptation? Then the body ceases to be a vessel of instinct alone. It becomes a field of meaning, a landscape that remembers every encounter, every warmth, every wound. Our skin, so thin, so easily marked, became the place where the universe made contact with us. Every raindrop, every gust of wind, every spark of flame left its trace upon it. We began to live not only in the world, but with it, through the sensation of our own surfaces. In the absence of fur, we discovered presence. In exposure, we discovered belonging. The skin did not just receive the world, it mirrored it. It became the measure of experience. When we stood in the morning sun, the heat upon our shoulders reminded us of where we were. When we pressed against another body, we felt not just touch but recognition. The simple wordless knowledge that we existed and so did they. This was not intellect. This was truth. Transmitted through the oldest sense of all. Before sound, before speech, there was contact. Before we named the stars, we knew the warmth of another heartbeat. And through that, something irreversible happened. The body became conscious of itself. The mirror that once belonged only to water or to eyes now lived within the mind. We could imagine our own image, imagine how others saw us, imagine the difference between who we were and who we wished to be. Hairlessness had made the body visible, and visibility made it self-aware. That awareness became both gift and burden, the joy of being recognised, and the ache of knowing one could be judged. We were no longer invisible to the world nor to ourselves, but this awareness, for all its complexity, was also the beginning of art, of meaning, of culture. The same instinct that made us cover our skin in hide or pigment led us to paint the walls of caves. The same urge to express the surface of the self gave rise to symbol, to gesture, to storytelling. In this sense, the body was our first canvas, and consciousness the brush that followed. We did not lose fur, we gained expression. We learned to sculpt identity in layers, through movement, adornment, memory. And even now, we remain artists of the flesh. We decorate, we scar, we tattoo, we pierce, we polish, not to conceal our humanity, but to shape it. The body has always been a work in progress, a visible reflection of an invisible becoming. Our skin continues to tell the story of what we are and what we wish to be. It records our living moments, our loves, our losses. It is the autobiography written by touch. In shedding fur, we did not abandon nature. We invited it in. We let it live upon us, as warmth, as wind, as awareness. Because to be human is not to rise above the world, but to feel it entirely. Every moment of sensation, every brush of wind or warmth of light, is a reminder that we are not separate from the earth but extensions of it, vessels of its weather, its elements, its pulse. The skin does not merely contain us, it participates in the world's unfolding. To feel is to belong, and the more we became capable of feeling, the more we were bound to the living fabric around us. Hairlessness amplified that connection, made us more porous, more attuned, more awake to the subtleties of existence. It allowed the world to touch us, and for us to touch the world back, and yet, to live in such exposure is to live in perpetual negotiation. Between comfort and danger, between isolation and closeness, between hiding and revelation, the naked body taught us the tension between safety and expression. We learned that to open ourselves to others was to risk harm, and also to invite love. That to be visible was to be vulnerable, but also to be known, and from this paradox grew empathy, morality, and imagination. The hairless skin demanded not only adaptation of the body, but evolution of the spirit. The philosophers of our distant ancestry were not seated in temples or writing on scrolls. They were travellers who walked barefoot across burning ground, whose every step required attention. Their awareness was not abstract. It was felt. It lived in their muscles, in their breathing, in their exposure. The question of meaning began with the question of being, and the question of being began with sensation. What does it mean to exist in a body so open that the world can mark it, can hurt it, can heal it? That question has never left us. It lingers in every brush of affection, in every hesitation before touch, in every act of concealment or self-expression. We still live between two desires, the wish to be protected and the wish to be seen. The ancient shedding of fur merely exposed this truth. It did not create it. To be human is to stand forever between those poles, to oscillate between the comfort of hiding and the ache of recognition. And this is where the human story finds its grace. We learn to turn what might have been weakness into art, what might have been shame into intimacy, what might have been loss into meaning. Hairlessness did not make us lesser mammals, it made us storytellers. It gave us a surface upon which to write, to paint, to symbolize our own becoming. The naked body became a manuscript of humanity's ongoing reflection. Each scar a sentence, each line of muscle a phrase, each wrinkle a paragraph of memory. The body, then, is not only our inheritance, but our philosophy. Every generation continues to write upon it, with gesture, with language, with touch, and through that writing we continue to rediscover what it means to be alive. The skin does not forget. It remembers sunlight and shadow, warmth and cold, comfort and harm. It is a living record. a biological memory of every place we've touched and every being who has touched us. And yet, unlike the mind, it cannot lie. It flushes in embarrassment, tightens in fear, softens in tenderness. It betrays what we hide and reveals what we wish concealed. In this way, our vulnerability became our greatest teacher. The body shows us what honesty looks like without words. It invites us to listen, not with thought, but with empathy. Through the ages, we have tried to master that vulnerability, to mask it, manage it, protect it. We built walls, then clothes, then entire cultures of modesty and propriety. We learned to decorate our skin, to encode meaning into pigment and jewellery, to tell others who we were without exposing too much. But beneath all these layers, the same truth remains. We crave connection. We want to be seen, but safely, to be touched, but gently. The legacy of our nakedness is not shame, it is longing. A longing to be met as we are, without disguise, without armour. In this light, our bareness was never a curse. It was the condition that made understanding possible. The hairless body became the instrument through which we learned empathy, a medium of shared recognition. When we see another person's pain, their warmth, their trembling, we are reminded that we too have felt these things. The mirror of the skin reflects not difference, but continuity. It shows that we are all built from the same soft architecture of sensation and awareness. And perhaps that is the deepest philosophical inheritance of our condition, that being human means existing in a state of openness. We were never meant to be creatures of concealment. We were meant to experience, to encounter, to respond. Our smoothness is not weakness. It is invitation. It asks us to step into relationship with the world, not to dominate it. It asks us to feel fully, to know joy not as absence of pain, but as its companion. The same nerves that ache in suffering are those that thrill in love. The same skin that burns in the sun glows in its warmth. We are built to carry contradiction. So we return again to the mirror, not to seek flawlessness, but to recognize depth. The reflection staring back is both ancient and immediate, the product of millennia of adaptation, yet still learning to understand itself. The skin we live in is not perfect, but it is profound. It is where the world meets the self. It is where our species' story, written in flesh and feeling, continues to unfold. And even now, beneath the hum of modern life, that ancient truth lingers just below the surface. The reminder that to live is to feel, and to feel is to know we are alive. For all our progress, for all our layers of civilization and cloth, we still inhabit the same fragile skin that carried us across the savannah. We still wince at the same cold, flush with the same warmth, ache with the same grief, and glow with the same love. The centuries have added tools and language, but they have not dulled the immediacy of touch. The body remains our first language, the unspoken syntax of being. It tells stories that words can only approximate, the shiver of awe, the softness of forgiveness, the quiet gravity of care. Every gesture, every glance, every trembling breath reminds us that the human story is not written only in the mind, it is written in sensation. This, then, is the final revelation. Our nakedness was never about loss. It was about inheritance. We did not lose fur, we gained awareness. We did not trade protection for weakness. We traded isolation for connection. In becoming visible to the world, we became visible to each other. The hairless body became the meeting point of all that is human, instinct and intellect, survival and beauty, vulnerability and strength. It is the form that binds us to our ancestors and to each other, a living link in the endless conversation between life and consciousness. And perhaps, standing here, before the mirror of time, we understand something our ancestors could only feel, that to live in this body is to participate in wonder. Every sensation, every breath, every ripple of light upon the skin is a dialogue with existence itself. We are not separate from the world we perceive, we are a continuation of it, shaped by it, mirrored in it. Our skin is not a wall, it is a membrane of exchange, a boundary that listens. Through it, we learn humility, curiosity, compassion. Through it, we remember what it means to belong. To be human, then, is to inhabit contradiction with grace. To know that exposure is not weakness, but the condition of empathy. To know that we are, and have always been, creatures of reflection, born of earth, refined by time, capable of seeing ourselves within the world and the world within ourselves. The hairless skin is both relic and revelation, both inheritance and promise. It is the evidence of what we once were, and the possibility of what we may still become. And so, as the journey closes, you stand once more before the mirror. The question that began this path, why are we hairless, no longer seeks a single answer. Instead, it reflects a truth that hums beneath every heartbeat, that our bareness is not our flaw, but our wisdom. It is the space where life touches consciousness. It is the skin we live in, luminous, listening, alive. Thank you for walking this long road through the heat and the ages, for tracing the story of our nakedness, and finding meaning in the skin we live in, fellow sapiens. If this story helped you feel a little more connected to the vast breathing past, if it sparked wonder or softened something in you, thank you for sharing your time here. Your attention is what keeps these stories alive. Perhaps a single image stayed with you, a thought, a sensation, the way sunlight might once have touched an ancestor's bare shoulder. Whether it was the shimmer of sweat beneath a burning sky, the fragile honesty of skin against wind, or the quiet power of being seen and seeing another. These are the moments that bind our small lives to an ancient continuity. If one of those images lingers, I'd love to hear it. Share it below as a quiet offering to this growing circle of thoughtful minds. And if you'd like to keep walking with us through deep time and human becoming, you can subscribe so you don't miss the next step in the story, where memory and evolution meet again. Until we meet again, stay curious, stay thoughtful,